Chapter 1394. After a while, Luo Fan turned to the Pagoda Venerable and said, "Fellow cultivator, now that the winner of our duel has been decided, I wonder when you will fulfill your wager?" The Pagoda Venerable's expression changed drastically. Their previous duel was a bet of their lives. If Luo Fan wanted to collect the wager, didn't that mean he wanted to take his life? As a level 9 pseudo-sage cultivator who had cultivated for trillions of years, he was already used to survival. He had almost completely forgotten that he could also die. He had forgotten that his life could also be taken away by others. Although he seemed angry when he bet his life with Luo Fan, it was more because his dignity had been challenged. He did not think that he would really lose his life like that. At this moment, he suddenly realized that his life was so fragile and that death was right in front of him. After hearing what Luo Fan said, he suddenly realized that his life was so fragile and that death was right in front of him. After realizing this, his originally tranquil state of mind suddenly disappeared and his expression became more and more ugly. He said reluctantly, "I have indeed lost. However, I am willing to use a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure as the wager. What do you think?" Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "A level 9 pseudo-sage treasure and a level 9 pseudo-sage cultivator. I don't think the value of the two is equal." The Pagoda Venerable was filled with hope and said, "Although I only have one level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, I can get another one. Why don't I use 2 level 9 pseudo-sage treasures as the wager?" Luo Fan just shook his head and said, "A duel is a duel. The wager has already been agreed upon. If we change it now, it will be disrespectful to this duel, disrespectful to this banquet, and disrespectful to all the cultivators here. Therefore, it's better not to change the wager." The Pagoda Venerable's expression became even uglier. "You're messing with me. Why do you say that? You didn't have any objections when we agreed on the wager. Now that you have lost, you actually want to change the wager. That's a bit unreasonable." The Pagoda Venerable's expression kept changing. Sometimes it was fierce, sometimes it was fearful, sometimes it was helpless. Suddenly, it turned into hatred. If it wasn't for the fact that his cultivation had been suppressed to the level 8 pseudo-sage and he hadn't recovered, he might have already pounced on Luo Fan to kill Luo Fan. After a long while, the Pagoda Venerable gritted his teeth. "Fellow Taoist has come to fight for the right to participate in the Tao discussion. It must be because of the treasure-seizing assembly. If I am willing to rely on fellow Taoist, I will hand over all of my gains from the treasure-seizing assembly to fellow Taoist. I'll also give you 2 level 9 pseudo-sage treasures. I wonder if you can let me go?" Luo Fan was tempted when he heard that. In fact, he didn't have any deep enmity with the Pagoda Venerable. If he could gain control of the Pagoda Venerable's power and have it help him participate in the treasure-seizing assembly and obtain the treasures left behind by the Master of the Book Venerable and the others, it seemed to be acceptable. However, after thinking for a while, Luo Fan shook his head and sighed. Although the two of them didn't have any deep enmity before. However, after experiencing the previous battle, this hatred had clearly been deeply planted in their hearts. Even if he let the Pagoda Venerable go now, and the Pagoda Venerable really used his own power to help him obtain more benefits from the treasure-seizing assembly, what would happen after that? After the Pagoda Venerable left, would he face Luo Fan calmly? Would he completely eliminate his enmity with Luo Fan? That was obviously impossible. Therefore, if Luo Fan let the Pagoda Venerable go after this, what awaited him in the future would be a long entanglement with a level 9 pseudo-sage. It would be a level 9 pseudo-sage eyeing him covetously all the time, who could bite him at any time when it was inconvenient for him. It could be said that if Luo Fan really did that, he would be taking a huge risk. If there were enough rewards, such as allowing him to attain the mixed Yuan Dao fruit and become a sage, then this risk would naturally be worth it. However, it was obvious that if he let the Pagoda Venerable go, He would at most obtain some treasures that would increase his strength a little, but wouldn't be of much use to him becoming a sage. This obviously wasn't a good reward, and it wasn't worth the risk. After thinking this through, Luo Fan's choice was already very obvious. He said indifferently, "Forget it. Although fellow Taoist's suggestion is very tempting, I don't care. Although your proposal is very tempting, I don't want a level 9 pseudo-sage mortal enemy to spy on me and cause me trouble all the time. Therefore, I hope that you will abide by the bet." The Pagoda Venerable's expression finally changed when he heard this. "No." With that, his body shook and suddenly collapsed. This collapse completely destroyed the space within the cave, causing the flow of time within the cave to become chaotic. It also caused the nomological laws in the cave to shatter inch by inch. This wasn't because the Pagoda Venerable had taken his own life after Luo Fan said this. Instead, the Pagoda Venerable was putting himself at death's door. He directly destroyed his own body and soul, turning everything into a terrifying destructive force to break the seal and defense of the cave and escape. Although he was only left with level 8 pseudo-sage cultivation due to the suppression of the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron, he was still a level 9 pseudo-sage. However, he was still a level 9 pseudo-sage after all, and the power he possessed was shockingly strong. The effect of such a sudden explosion was extremely extraordinary. After all, this cave was only a place for a level 9 pseudo-sage to hold a banquet. It wasn't a place for level 9 pseudo-sage existences to fight fiercely. The Pagoda Venerable borrowed all the power of a level 9 pseudo-sage and used it mysteriously, instantly breaking through the seal of the cave and sending his life source out in an extremely secretive way. As a level 9 pseudo-sage that had lived for countless years, even if the Pagoda Venerable didn't expect to die, he must have made many preparations to be reborn. As long as his life source escaped, it wouldn't take long for him to completely recover, and even return to the level 9 pseudo-sage realm. The Book Supreme sighed at this moment. As expected, he's going to escape with that. He patted the void. In an instant, his palm reached into the void and made a slight grabbing motion. In an instant, the Pagoda Venerable's life source fell into his hand. He directly retrieved it and returned to the cave. "No. I don't want to die. I still want to become a sage. I want to be eternal and indestructible. I won't die here." The Pagoda Venerable's life source roared. This voice was inaudible to mortals. But to all the cultivators present, including Zhan Huang who was just a Khanate Grand Luo, they could hear it clearly. Hearing this scream, everyone present had a complicated expression on their faces. Even Luo Fan, who was the cause of all this, had a complicated expression on his face. A level 9 pseudo-sage that had lived for trillions of years actually behaved so clumsily in the face of death. The terror of death. One could imagine, their strength and status were comparable to the Pagoda Venerable. In fact, they weren't much stronger. At this moment, the Pagoda Venerable's behavior suddenly made them feel sympathetic. Almost everyone couldn't help but think that the Pagoda Venerable was the same. How would they behave in the face of death? Could they behave better than the Pagoda Venerable? And when they thought of this, the answer they received made them feel a little ashamed. Because almost all the cultivators knew that they wouldn't behave better than the Pagoda Venerable. In fact, some cultivators even clearly realized that they would behave worse than the Pagoda Venerable in the face of death. The Book Supreme sighed and said, "Why bother? Since you know you can't keep your life, why not leave some dignity?" With that, he raised his hand and shook it. The Pagoda Venerable's life essence once again appeared in the void that had calmed down. It appeared alive in front of everyone. Of course, the Pagoda Venerable wouldn't listen to the Book Supreme. He roared and struggled frantically, trying to break free from this cave abode and escape. The Book Supreme didn't care about him. After saying that, he turned to Luo Fan and said, "Friend, my disciple has a great feud with the Pagoda Venerable. I wonder if you can let him deal the final blow to complete the bet? Luo Fan didn't have a strong desire to kill the pagoda venerable with his own hands. Therefore, he said indifferently, as long as the pagoda venerable completes the bet, it doesn't matter who takes his life. Hearing this, Zhan Huang bowed to the Book Supreme to express his gratitude. Then, he bowed to Luo Fan and thanked Luo Fan. Then, he turned to face the pagoda venerable with an indescribable expression. This expression seemed to be filled with hatred, pity, and some indescribable emotions. No matter what, the pagoda venerable was one of the existences that had created him. Such an existence was simply like his god of creation. Zhan Huang could not completely cast aside his feelings for the pagoda venerable. Sighing, Zhan Huang raised his hand and formed a hand seal. In an instant, all the power in the cave abode was mobilized by him. A golden blade appeared in the void and hung high above the pagoda venerable's life essence. Then, it slowly slashed down at the pagoda venerable. At this moment, the pagoda venerable was even more furious. A cultivator who isn't even as sage to be wants to hurt me? He roared and raised his hand to slap upwards. In an instant, the void trembled. The sharp blade that he had condensed the power of the entire cave abode was instantly smashed into pieces. The powerful impact swept in all directions, causing the space-time of the entire cave abode to vibrate violently. Although the pagoda venerable was only a life essence without any power, he was still a level 9 pseudo-sage to be, who was qualified to break through to the sage realm and obtain the holy decree. Even if he didn't have any power, he wasn't someone a connate grand Luo cultivator could hurt. When he slapped his palm just now, there were millions upon millions of transformations. It turned out that the little bit of power that was triggered by the slap of his palm had been channeled by him. It was continuously transmitted and grew, finally turning into a shocking power that instantly dispersed the powerful god art that Zhan Huang had expended all of his energy to activate. Zhan Huang's face turned red. At this moment, he looked at the pagoda venerable with a solemn expression. There was no longer any hatred or pity. Pity was an emotion that could only be born when one looked down on someone. Previously, when Zhan Huang looked at the pagoda venerable, it was like looking at a fish on a chopping board. He felt that he could easily deal with the pagoda venerable. But now, he suddenly realized that the pagoda venerable wasn't a fish. Instead, he was a shark that could tear him apart. How could he still have such feelings? Luo Fan stood at the side with an extremely calm expression. Since he had already handed this matter over to the Book Supreme, he naturally wouldn't ask what the Book Supreme planned and did as long as the results met his requirements. Whether this Zhan Huang could take care of the pagoda venerable. How could he do it? To him, all of this was meaningless. Zhan Huang suddenly put his hands together. Endless power condensed and a strong golden light exploded from his hands. It directly enveloped his entire body. Then, he roared. He pounced forward and punched the pagoda venerable's life essence. At this moment, all the level 9 pseudo-sage to be present could see it. The technique that Zhan Huang used was a technique that borrowed boundless energy to strengthen his body. Under the golden light, the strength of Zhan Huang's body had already far surpassed the level of a connate grand heavenly realm cultivator. It even surpassed the level of an initial stage or minor stage sage. It was vaguely showing the demeanor of a medium stage sage. The pagoda venerable already knew that all his plans to escape would no longer work. All he could do now was to explode with the brilliance of battle at the last moment and protect his last bit of dignity in the final battle. After knowing this, the pagoda venerable put aside all the level 9 pseudo-saints who were watching and focused all his attention on Zhan Huang. Although Zhan Huang's strength was a little weak, he was still the last choice in the battle. If the pagoda venerable didn't want to be crushed to death by the Book Supreme, he had no choice but to fight the pagoda venerable, although he no longer had any power. The Pagoda Venerable was still able to exert unimaginable strength with the help of his own realm. This battle actually crushed Zhan Huang in a domineering manner. It made Zhan Huang exhausted and unable to defeat the Pagoda Venerable. On the contrary, it was the Pagoda Venerable who was injured time and time again. The cave abode changed according to the Pagoda Venerable's will. When the two of them started fighting, a vast world was born naturally and became their battlefield. Therefore, the battle between the two of them did not affect the other cultivators. Instead, it provided them with a show for the banquet. If this goes on, I'm afraid Zhan Huang will be in danger. The remnant Venerable smiled beside the Book Supreme. The Book Supreme said faintly, "Let's wait. He hasn't exerted all his strength yet." It seemed like he wanted to use the Pagoda Venerable to train the disciple he had just accepted. Luo Fan only took a few glances at the battle between the Pagoda Venerable and Zhan Huang before shifting his gaze to the many level 9 pseudo-saints around him. He wanted to see if there were any changes in them after the battle between him and the Pagoda Venerable. A faint smile appeared on his face as he took a closer look. He knew that he had achieved his goal. At this moment, none of the over 200 level 9 pseudo-saints present dared to show their malice towards him. At least on the surface, all the level 9 pseudo-saints treated him kindly, as if they really wanted to make friends with him. Indeed, it's all about strength. Luo Fan sighed inwardly and finally felt relieved. The reason why he had made such an intense bet with the Pagoda Venerable was because of the current situation. Before this, the many Class 9 pseudo-saints had ill intentions towards him. They wanted to ambush him after he left this place and snatch the holy decree that he possessed. They didn't even bother to hide their intentions and directly revealed their ill intentions. They clearly didn't take him seriously at all. They didn't think that he was strong enough to withstand their attacks. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan didn't make any moves to change the situation, then what awaited him would be endless schemes, sneak attacks, and attacks. In this way, even if Luo Fan was confident that those level 9 pseudo-saints wouldn't be too much of a threat to him. However, if those level 9 pseudo-saints joined forces, or if they didn't and some of them just happened to gather together to attack him, he wouldn't have much confidence that he would be unscathed. It was because of this that Luo Fan realized that this was an opportunity when the Pagoda Venerable challenged him. An opportunity to show his strength and prove to everyone that he was qualified to possess the holy decree. That was why he made such a high-profile bet with the Pagoda Venerable. And judging from the change in the attitude of the people in front of him, his plan had obviously succeeded. The many level 9 pseudo-saints present had completely realized how powerful he was. They no longer dared to openly show their malice like they did in the beginning. Although he knew that there must be some among these level 9 pseudo-saints who were unwilling to give up and wanted to snatch his holy decree, there were only a few of them. For Luo Fan, he was confident enough to deal with them. He already had enough confidence to deal with them, no matter what those level 9 pseudo-saints thought. When Luo Fan looked at them, they all greeted him with a smile. He acted as if he and Luo Fan were old friends who had a very deep friendship. Luo Fan only smiled faintly at them and didn't show any arrogance. He also nodded and smiled. This was considered a greeting. While Luo Fan was secretly weighing the mentality of the people, the battle between Zhan Huang and the Pagoda Venerable had already reached the final stage. The Pagoda Venerable had already forced Zhan Huang into a corner and weakened him to the limit. Zhan Huang was almost unable to fight anymore. At this moment, the Book Venerable, who was watching from the outside, finally reacted. He smiled faintly and opened his mouth, sending a mysterious scripture directly into the world and into the mind of the Pagoda Venerable. He didn't hide this scripture, so all the level 9 pseudo-saints present could hear it. Even the Pagoda Venerable in that world could hear it clearly. In this cave abode, everyone who heard this scripture was someone with an extremely high level of cultivation. In an instant, everyone understood the meaning of the scripture. This scripture was to guide a connate grand Luo cultivator on how to become a demi-saint and how to change the origin of life. It was clearly a technique that was completely targeted at Zhan Huang's current situation. With this scripture, Zhan Huang would not need much time to break through the connate grand Luo and become a demi-saint. Moreover, his origin of life would also be reconstructed, and the power of his divine abilities would undergo a tremendous change. When that time came, it would be extremely easy for him to defeat the current Pagoda Venerable. While the grade 9 pseudo-martial saints outside were secretly interested, the Pagoda Venerate's expression changed drastically. However, he had already expected this to happen. He gritted his teeth and sped up his attacks without saying a word. Zhan Huang's body froze when he heard the scripture. Then, his body suddenly emitted an intense clear light. The clear light was so pure and condensed that it seemed like the purest and most condensed light in the world. After it appeared, it naturally formed a strange space that directly enveloped the spacetime within a radius of 10,000 miles. Zhan Huang's cultivation level broke through a level within the clear light, and his strength skyrocketed. In the blink of an eye, his strength had increased by hundreds and thousands of times. For the Pagoda Venerable in the past, such an increase was like a tiny ant growing into a huge one. However, for Zhan Huang, it was like a mortal growing into a giant. In an instant, the Pagoda Venerable who couldn't react in time was blasted away by the aura. Before Zhan Huang could stabilize his cultivation level, he flashed over to the Pagoda Venerable and said, "Let's end this." As he spoke, he raised his hand and slammed his fist at the Pagoda Venerable. The power of the punch was shocking. It created countless spatial fragments that condensed into a round hammer that shook violently as it smashed down at the Pagoda Venerable. The Pagoda Venerable screamed and used the surrounding energy to condense layers of defense in an attempt to block the punch. Unfortunately, the power of the punch had exceeded the limits of the surroundings. The countless layers of defense instantly crumbled, and the punch smashed directly into the Pagoda Venerable's body. In an instant, the Pagoda Venerable shattered into tens of thousands of pieces. Moreover, these pieces continued to shatter and shrink in the void. In the end, they turned into nothingness and disappeared from the universe. However, under the bombardment of this punch, his body and Tao were directly destroyed, and his soul was scattered. After the punch, Zhan Huang floated in the void in a daze. He seemed to be smiling yet not smiling, and he seemed to be crying yet not crying. Chapter 1395. Seeing the Tower Venerable die, Luo Fan sighed but didn't say anything. After such a life-or-death battle, it was naturally impossible for the banquet to continue. However, the banquet had been going on for a long time. Ending it now didn't mean that it was going to end halfway. Therefore, the level 9 pseudo-divine sages talked for a while and agreed on how to contact each other. Then, they left the cave abode and dispersed. After everyone dispersed, Luo Fan said to the Book Venerable and the others, "I'm really sorry that this has delayed the banquet." The Book Venerable chuckled and said, "Why do you say that? This gamble is also a rule of the banquet. How can it be delayed? I still have to thank you. If it wasn't for you, how could I have gotten such a good disciple?" Hearing this, Luo Fan could only smile. After thinking about it, he asked, "I've often heard of Tao discussion, but where is it held? I almost forgot that this is your first time participating in the Tao discussion." The Book Venerable was a little ashamed. With that said, he raised his hand and pointed. A ray of light rushed out from his hand and instantly appeared in front of Luo Fan. With a glance, Luo Fan knew that this was the spiritual light of the place where the Tao discussion was held. Without any hesitation, he reached out and caught the spiritual light. The information contained within it instantly appeared in his mind. This was the location of a great thousand world. This great thousand world seemed to be many times more powerful than a normal great thousand world. According to the description of the information, This world was not much weaker than the demon realm, however. It was a pity that the time wasn't up yet and other level 9 pseudo-divine sages were not welcome to enter. In other words, Luo Fan's original plan to head to the place where the Tao discussion was held and wait for the start of the Tao discussion was no longer feasible. Realizing this, Luo Fan sighed helplessly and said, "I see. Looks like I'll have to disturb everyone on this island for the next few years." Haha. Fellow Taoist, what are you saying? This island is so vast, how can we occupy it all? Tao friend, you can just casually open up a cave on this island. How could you say that I'm disturbing you? Luo Fan chuckled and said a few more words. Then, he took his leave. There wasn't anything that was too important to him now, and spending a few hundred years of time to wait for the Tao discussion to be held wasn't a big deal to him. In fact, apart from Luo Fan, there were many other level 9 pseudo-saints who had settled down on the island and were waiting for the Tao discussion to take place. Apart from some of these level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators, most of them wanted to find pseudo-holy stage cultivators who could join them during the treasure-seizing meet. There were many false saints on this island. After all, only a small number of cultivators were able to pass the test set by the book Venerate and obtain the qualifications to participate in the Tao discussion spell assembly. Of course, most of the cultivators would fail. As for the cultivators who failed to be selected, if they didn't want to lose the chance to participate in the Tao exchange, they could only rely on these 9th-level pseudo-sages and help them participate in the treasure-seizing assembly in the future. Therefore, for the many level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators, it wasn't difficult to find pseudo-holy stage cultivators to rely on them. However, since these pseudo-holy stage cultivators could come to this island to participate in the test, they naturally knew the pros and cons of relying on other level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators to participate in the Tao discussion spell assembly. Knowing this, even if they had to rely on some level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators to participate in the Tao discussion spell assembly, they would still be very cautious. They would carefully choose the target they would rely on. Just like this, level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators would choose other level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators. This caused the island to become much more lively than it had been in the past few years. Some level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators had good reputations and were highly sought after by other pseudo-holy stage cultivators. Dozens or even hundreds of pseudo-holy stage cultivators wanted to rely on them so that they could participate in the Tao discussion spell assembly. However, some level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators had bad reputations, causing many pseudo-holy stage cultivators to be afraid of being chosen. Just like this, sometimes the level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators would set up some tests on the island, causing many pseudo-holy stage cultivators to flock to them. Sometimes, the tests set up by some level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators would be neglected, causing the entire island to fall silent. Many pseudo-holy stage cultivators didn't even dare to move around casually, afraid that they would accidentally fall into those tests and be forced to participate in the Tao discussion spell assembly by the level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators. This completely different treatment was nothing to ordinary pseudo-holy stage cultivators. However, among the level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators, they treated it as a joke. Luo Fan originally thought that it would be very boring for him to stay on this island and that he could only cultivate and comprehend Tao by himself. However, he didn't expect the days he spent on this island to be extremely lively. The strength that Luo Fan displayed at the banquet had made all the level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators take him seriously. No matter what they thought, they didn't dare to treat him lightly. Among them, there were even many level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators who wanted to get to know him. Therefore, in the hundreds of years that Luo Fan opened his cave abode on this island, a level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivator would visit Luo Fan almost every few days to chat with him and exchange feelings. This kind of exchange allowed Luo Fan to unknowingly integrate into the circle of level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators. Since those level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators often visited, Luo Fan naturally couldn't not pay them a visit. Therefore, he had to visit other level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators from time to talk about heaven, earth, and the universe. As such, Luo Fan gradually learned about the legends of level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators. He also understood the personalities and tendencies of many level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators. At the same time, Luo Fan's name, Luo Zun, had unknowingly spread far and wide, and was gradually recognized by more and more cultivators. Even a 9th-level venerable had recognized this name, so how could other cultivators not recognize it? As the name of Luo Zun became more and more famous, an inexplicable change gradually appeared. On this day, on the 183rd year of Luo Fan's residence on this island, Luo Fan was observing the state of chaos in his cave abode, comprehending the various mysteries within it, either to supplement his worldview or to advance his cultivation realm. All of a sudden, Luo Fan frowned and discovered that an level 8 pseudo-holy stage cultivator had appeared outside his cave abode. This level 8 pseudo-holy stage cultivator was something that Luo Fan had heard of from other level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators before. He was a level 8 pseudo-holy stage cultivator that was recognized as a genius. His name was Kai Fuzi, and he had only cultivated for 300 billion years. Among the many level 8 pseudo-holy stage cultivators, he was definitely a young and promising genius cultivator. Back then, when he told Luo Fan about this level 9 pseudo-holy stage Kai Fuzi, he spoke with an extremely regretful expression. His tone was filled with regret for Kai Fuzi's arrogance and rejection of his recruitment. After hearing what the level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivator had said, that Luo Fan had been paying attention to this person out of curiosity. He was secretly surprised when he noticed this person. Kai Fuzi was extremely powerful. His comprehension was even higher, and the path he cultivated was a space-time path. To him, time and space were like his own hands that he could easily manipulate. He could control them at will. What Luo Fan had comprehended with great difficulty in the past was something as simple as eating and drinking for him to construct an incomparably complete world with the help of time or space. Such a level 8 pseudo-holy stage cultivator would almost certainly become a level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivator in the future, or even reach the sage realm and obtain a holy will. Perhaps because of this, Kai Fuzi didn't care about the recruitment of other level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators. Even when facing level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators, he was neither servile nor overbearing. He didn't act like he was inferior just because his cultivation realm was lower than theirs. Why would such a level 8 pseudo-holy stage cultivator appear outside his cave abode at this time? Luo Fan could not help but be curious. After Kai Fuzi arrived outside Luo Fan's cave abode, he bowed towards it and said, "I'm Kai Fuzi. I hope Senior Luo Zun can recommend me to participate in the Tao discussion conference. I'm willing to do everything I can to help Senior Luo Zun gain more in the treasure-seizing conference." Hearing this, Luo Fan couldn't help but be stunned. This Kai Fuzi didn't care about the recruitment of other level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivators, but he took the initiative to come to him, a cultivator who wasn't even a level 9 pseudo-holy stage cultivator? What kind of hobby was this? Out of curiosity, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved. Instantly, the door of his cave abode suddenly opened, revealing itself in front of Kai Fuzi. Then, he said, "Come in and talk." Kai Fuzi bowed again and said, "Thank you, Senior Luo Zun, for giving me the chance to speak." Saying this, he stepped into Luo Fan's cave abode and appeared in front of Luo Fan in the blink of an eye. This cave abode was opened up by Luo Fan. The entire cave abode was a boundless starry sky. Luo Fan's current position was only on a flat surface with a radius of 100,000 feet in the starry sky. When Kai Fuzi stepped into the cave abode, he appeared directly on this flat surface. When Kai Fuzi saw his surroundings clearly, he couldn't help but reveal an expression of surprise and admiration. He bowed towards Luo Fan and said, "Kai Fuzi greets Senior Luo Zun." Luo Fan raised his hand and said, "No need to be so polite." However, he didn't use the cave abode's power or his own power to forcefully lift Kai Fuzi up. Kai Fuzi was, after all, a Class 8 false saint, and his own cultivation realm was much higher than his. This kind of action that could only be done with a huge difference in cultivation realm was a little inappropriate for him to do. Not to mention how Kai Fuzi would feel, just the strength he used was a little hard to control. If he used too little strength and couldn't lift Kai Fuzi up, that would be a very embarrassing thing. And if he used too much strength and lifted Kai Fuzi off the ground, that wouldn't look good either. Therefore, Luo Fan's best course of action was obviously only one, and that was to directly make a gesture and let the bobber stand up on its own. This not only showed his respect for the bobber, but also prevented him from losing face due to improper strength. Kai Fuzi straightened his body. Luo Fan looked at Kai Fuzi. He found out that he was an extremely handsome young man with an indescribable aura. As he stood there, he exuded the aura of an absolute winner in life. That legendary jade tree seemed to be an adjective specially created for him. "Do you know that my cultivation realm is only a Class 5 false saint?" Luo Fan sized up Kai Fuzi and asked. "This is a legend in the world, of course I know about it." "Then do you know that the other Class 9 false saints are very interested in you and want to recommend you to participate in the Tao discussion?" Luo Fan asked again. "Many seniors love me so much. I'm not someone who doesn't know what's good for me, so of course I know about it," Kai Fuzi said. Luo Fan frowned and said, "Since you know that my cultivation realm is far inferior to yours, and there are many grade 9 pseudo-sages interested in you, why did you ask me to recommend you to participate in the Tao discussion?" He was now recognized by the Book Supreme and the others as having the equivalent of a Class 9 false saint. The right to participate in the Tao discussion. Of course, he had the ability to recommend other false saints to participate in the Tao discussion. However, having this ability did not mean that he would recommend other false saints. After all, he was only a level 5 pseudo-sage. If he recommended someone below level 5 pseudo-sage to participate in the Tao discussion, it would be like a child recommending an adult to attend a banquet. However, if he recommended a cultivator above level 5 pseudo-sage to participate in the Tao discussion, it would be like a child recommending an adult to attend a banquet. It would also seem a little awkward. So, it turned out, Luo Fan had never thought of recommending someone to participate in the Tao discussion. First, a Class 8 false saint suddenly came to him. How could he not be curious and feel that it was unbelievable? Kai Fuzi said firmly, "Senior Luo Zun's ability is known to the world. He is an ultimate venerable, but it cannot be judged by cultivation realm. I wholeheartedly pursue the strong, so of course I will choose Senior Luo Zun." Ultimate Venerable was what the cultivators in the demon realm, who knew about the existence of the holy decree, called the Class 9 false saints who failed to break through to the sage realm and obtained the holy decree. Since Kai Fuzi called Luo Fan an omnipotent venerable, he obviously knew that Luo Fan had grasped a type of holy decree. He knew that Luo Fan's ability was already above a normal Class 9 false saint. "So that's what you think?" Luo Fan came to a realization. Kai Fuzi nodded. "That's right. My ability is actually quite far away from a real ultimate venerable," Luo Fan said. "Senior Luo Zun is too humble. If you don't have the ability of an ultimate venerable, how can other Class 9 false saints acknowledge you?" Kai Fuzi said. Luo Fan shook his head and smiled. He did not continue this topic and said, For people who understand, my ability is indeed not below a Class 9 false saint. But for ordinary people, I'm only a Class 5 false saint. I'm only a level 5 pseudo-sage, but you, a level 8 pseudo-sage, want to rely on me? Don't you feel ashamed? Kai Fuzi said indifferently, although I can't find the path to become a Class 9 false saint, I still have some Tao heart. How can these words of others leave any mark in my heart? Luo Fan laughed and said, indeed. To be able to become a false saint, one's Tao heart should be firm and unshakable. Since you've already decided for me to recommend you, then you must have made up your mind. No matter what I say, you won't be shaken. Kai Fuzi bowed, indicating that Luo Fan's words were correct. Luo Fan did not wait for him to reply and said, since that's the case, I'll tell you the truth. Actually, I've never thought of recommending anyone to participate in the Tao discussion. Participating in the treasure-seizing assembly is just an experience for me. I don't expect to gain anything from it. Hearing this, Kai Fuzi's eyes flashed with a hint of, as expected. Luo Fan's actions over the years were no secret to those with discerning eyes. Anyone with a bit of analysis would be able to tell what his mentality was like. Since Kai Fuzi dared to ask Luo Fan to recommend him, he had obviously researched Luo Fan. How could he not know his mentality? I'm aware of that. However, recommending someone won't cause Senior any loss. Moreover, although Senior doesn't expect much from the treasure-seizing assembly, it's always a good thing to get more treasures. I think Senior shouldn't refuse the help of a powerful cultivator. Kai Fuzi said. Luo Fan heard this and laughed heartily. You're right. Hearing this, a look of relief appeared on Kai Fuzi's face. He felt that this matter had already been settled. However, Luo Fan quickly changed the topic and said, however, I still have a doubt. If you can answer it, I'll give you a chance to test me. If you can't answer it, Luo Fan didn't finish his sentence. However, the meaning behind his words could not be more obvious. Evidently, he was going back to where he came from. Kai Fuzi's expression stiffened, but he quickly gathered himself and said, Senior, please ask. I'll tell you everything I know. I'll tell you everything I know. Luo Fan said plainly, you're publicly acknowledged as a genius. All the level 9 pseudo-saints who told me about you declared that you'll definitely reach level 9 in the future and step onto the 9th step. You even have a great chance of becoming a supreme venerable in the future. With this kind of talent, strength, and potential, you're definitely able to pass the test set by the Book Supreme and obtain the right to participate in the Tao discussion assembly. If that's the case, why didn't you take the right path and instead chose the rugged path of relying on other level 9 pseudo-saints? Hearing this, Kai Fuzi fell silent. After a long while, he then said, this matter involves a secret of mine. I hope Senior can keep it a secret for me. Speak your mind. To you, these are your secrets, words of utmost importance. But to me, they are merely words. Why would I say anything more? If you don't believe me, then turn around and leave. If you believe me, then tell me. Luo Fan said. Kai Fuzi sighed and said, I naturally believe Senior. Since Senior wants to know, then I'll tell you. Next, Kai Fuzi said a long paragraph. Luo Fan suddenly didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard this, because the content of the story made him feel that it was a bit melodramatic. The reason why Kai Fuzi wasn't willing to participate in the Book Supreme's test and obtain the right to participate in the Tao discussion assembly was because of Wu Zun. Or, to be more specific, she was one of Wu Zun's former confidants and his current Tao companion. Hundreds of billions of years ago, Kai Fuzi was a disciple of a sect in the demon realm. At that time, Wu Zun's Tao companion was an elder of this sect. Because of certain events, the two of them crossed paths and came into contact, and so on and so forth. Gradually, Kai Fuzi's heart was moved by Wu Zun's Tao companion. After that, Kai Fuzi worked hard to cultivate He wanted to grow to the point where he was worthy of Wu Zun's Tao companion and come back to explain things to that woman and become Tao companions. But unexpectedly, that woman met Wu Zun when she went out to travel. From then on, she didn't return to the sect and went far away with Wu Zun. When Kai Fuzi finally became a false sage, he wanted to find that woman and explain things to her, but found that she was nowhere to be found. After searching for a while, he found out that she had already become someone else's Tao companion. This was a shocking truth. At that time, he felt as if he could destroy the heavens and the earth, but still not be able to vent his frustration. His hatred towards Wu Zun could be imagined. Although such a thing had happened hundreds of millions of years ago, it was still not enough. But to Kai Fuzi, it was something that he couldn't forget no matter how much time passed. Therefore, even if that woman might have forgotten about Kai Fuzi, he still didn't want to get the right to participate in the Tao discussion from someone who had a close relationship with Wu Zun. It was precisely because of this that he came looking for Luo Fan at this moment to ask for his recommendation. Hearing Kai Fuzi's story, Luo Fan could only shake his head helplessly. Who would have thought that after going around in circles, it was all because of Wu Zun, because of a woman, other things were fine, but Luo Fan couldn't say much about the hatred of stealing his wife. Therefore, Luo Fan could only nod and say, "You're not telling the truth. But I agree with your explanation. I'll give you a chance to test me. As long as you pass my test, I'll recommend you to participate in the Tao discussion." Kai Floater instinctively wanted to explain that he wasn't lying, but when he heard Luo Fan's last sentence, he swallowed his original explanation and said, "Thank you, Senior Luo Zun." Luo Fan only smiled and clapped his hand in the air. In an instant, strange worlds started to appear in the air. Chapter 1396. These worlds were all different in nature and structure. The rules and laws within them were all different and focused on different things. The speed at which these worlds appeared was unimaginable. In an instant, hundreds of millions of worlds appeared directly in front of Luo Fan and Kai Fuzi. The changes involved were extremely complicated. Even though Kai Fuzi was a powerful level 8 pseudosage, he could only see Luo Fan's initial actions clearly. He could only see the mysteries of the first few worlds. As for the latter worlds, they changed too quickly and were too complicated. He could not understand them at all. Seeing Luo Fan's actions and the results of these actions, Kai Fuzi could not help but be shocked. This method was even more mysterious, profound, and mysterious than the other level 9 pseudosages he had seen before. Although this person before him was a level 5 pseudosage, his strength was actually stronger than an ordinary level 9 pseudosage. After discovering this, the faint arrogance that he originally had completely disappeared. Luo Fan very quickly opened up the many worlds he needed. All the worlds formed a halo in front of him. Within the halo, light and shadow flowed, showing the changes of countless worlds. Enter this cluster of worlds. If you can get out within 100 years, you will pass my test, Luo Fan said faintly. Kai Fuzi was furious. 100 years? Even if it was a test set by the Book Supreme, he was confident that he could get through it within a day. This person in front of him actually dared to say that he would waste 100 years of his time with this small test. This was simply looking down on his ability. How could he not be furious? At this moment, Kai Fuzi made up his mind. He had to get through these clusters of worlds in the shortest time possible. Get out of this world. It would be best if he could get out within today. Seeing Kai Fuzi's expression, Luo Fan knew what he was thinking. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, the flow of time in this world is much faster than the outside world. 100 years is roughly equivalent to 100,000 years inside. That's enough time for you to explore." Hearing this, the anger between Kai Fuzi's brows lessened. After all, he had seen what Luo Fan had done previously. That kind of divine ability that he couldn't comprehend at all was truly powerful. After seeing it, he could only feel shocked. For a person with such strength to repeat the question of time so seriously, he must be serious. In that case, was this test really that difficult? Did they need to waste so much time to get through? With such worries and thoughts, he certainly couldn't just be as infuriated as before. Instead, he began to carefully recall the characteristics of the worlds that Luo Fan had opened up. Unfortunately, he had only seen the first few worlds, and the information he obtained was so little. How could there be any gains? After thinking it through, Kai Fuzi bowed and said, "I understand. Senior Luo Zun, please open the door and let me take the test." Luo Fan did not hesitate. He smiled and said, "Since you're ready, let's begin." Then, he raised his hand and pointed at the halo in front of him. Instantly, the halo spun and a door appeared in front of Kai Fuzi. Kai Fuzi stepped into the door without hesitation. As he stepped into the door, it shook slightly and disappeared without a trace. Then, the light that appeared in the center of the halo stabilized. It no longer showed the appearance of countless worlds rotating. Instead, it was fixed on one world, shining on one of the countless worlds. That world was not the others. It was the world that appeared after Kai Fuzi stepped into it. This world had extremely strange rules. It was a world created for battle and destruction. This entire world, all existences, all of them had the same body, the same power and the same speed. Using the exact same physical state, they continued to fight and resurrect in that world, again and again, from the endless past, all the way to the endless future. At this moment, Kai Fuzi had entered this world. Moreover, his body, his power, his speed, and even his cultivation were all suppressed to the point that they were no different from any living being in this world. Kai Fuzi was an extremely powerful level 8 pseudo-saint. Although this body was still extremely unfamiliar to him, with his mind, he was still able to unleash unimaginable power. Before he could completely adapt to this body, he had already started a massacre. He cut off the heads of dozens of living beings that attacked him to gain some time to familiarize himself with the state of his body. How is it possible that everything has been stripped to such a level? Every drop of my power was cultivated by myself. Every drop has completely fused with my foundation. Even a supreme venerable can't strip my power. How can this Luo Zun strip my power to such a level? Kai Fuzi's mind was in shock. He could not calm down at all. He was not Luo Fan. Although he had countless fortuitous encounters, visited many powerful cultivators, and listened to many level 9 pseudo-saint preachings, he had never encountered a test that completely stripped his power and cultivation realm. This test that made his body extremely weak instantly made his mind lose balance. He could no longer maintain his original attitude that was neither servile nor overbearing. Suddenly, Kai Fuzi's body exerted the wrong force. With a muffled bang, his entire body exploded from his own power. It turned into a bloody mist that was blown away by the wind. This was the first time he had died in this world. The instant Kai Fuzi died, Kai Fuzi's body appeared from nothingness in the 3,600 resurrection points in this world. However, this time, his eyes were a little blank. He seemed to have forgotten something. The memory of how he died was completely forgotten. What happened just now? Right, I'm participating in Luo Zun's test. What is this world? How did my body become so weak? Just as he was thinking about this, a wave flashed past. His body disappeared from the resurrection point and was randomly thrown into a battlefield in this world. There were billions of living beings in this world. They were constantly killing each other in countless battlefields in this world. However, there were only 3,600 resurrection points. One could imagine how busy the resurrection points were. The instant Kai Fuzi was delayed at the resurrection point, hundreds of thousands of similar living beings appeared beside him in a daze. If there wasn't such a mechanism to quickly transfer living beings, the resurrection point would have been completely filled up within a few seconds. The living beings that came later would probably not even have the space to resurrect. Kai Fuzi suddenly landed on the battlefield. Instantly, dozens of living beings attacked him. These living beings' attacking methods were amazing. They could utilize their own power by almost 100%. If they were in the mortal world, each of these living beings would definitely be considered a martial arts master. One person would definitely have no problem dealing with an army. However, Kai Fuzi was about to break through to level 8 pseudo-saint. His utilization of his body was not just 100%. It was almost 1,000%, 10,000%, or even 100,000%. Even without using his body's power, he could unleash super destructive power. Moreover, his own power was no different from other living beings. Faced with the shocking attacks of the dozens of living beings, Kai Fuzi merely frowned. He raised his hand and punched out. In an instant, the endless mysteries of martial arts were contained within it. As he raised his hand and punched, he easily crushed the dozens of living beings that had the same power as him. He did not just kill them. Instead, he completely crushed them like an adult crushing ants. One could imagine how strong his control over power was. However, this method did not come without a price. This was because he was already used to controlling vast and powerful power. The bobber couldn't grasp the little power that it currently possessed. In that instant, he had already plundered too much of the power that his body had. He had actually squeezed out all the potential of his body. Instead, his body went limp, and he almost lost all his fighting ability. This won't do. This body is simply too weak. I have to create a corresponding cultivation method to use the power. Otherwise, this body will collapse after a few times like this. With this thought, Kai Fuzi's heart moved slightly. Countless words and images flashed through his mind. After all, he was a level 8 pseudo-saint. He was the peak existence that was closest to level 9 pseudo-saint in the entire demon world. This kind of existence had long formed their own Tao. Under normal circumstances, it would be a simple and easy task to create a cultivation method that could allow ordinary people to cultivate directly to the pseudo-sage level. Creating a cultivation method that was suitable for his current body was obviously a piece of cake for him. In the blink of an eye, Kai Fuzi had created an extremely mysterious martial art cultivation method. This martial art cultivation method was extremely profound. If any ordinary person obtained this cultivation method and understood its profoundness, it would be extremely easy for them to unleash the power of 5,000 kilograms with 4 tails of strength. However, compared to Kai Fuzi, the offensive power of this cultivation method was secondary. To Kai Fuzi, the most significant thing was the upper limit of the power that this cultivation method could unleash. It was precisely because there was a limit to this cultivation method that when Kai Fuzi used this cultivation method, he would not be able to use all the potential and foundation of his body like when he used his own will. As a result, his body would be like a lamp that ran out of oil, and in the end, he would be like a fish on a chopping board. After Kai Floater created the martial arts technique he needed, the other creatures around him had already pounced on him while yelling and shouting. Kai Fuzi did not know if it was an illusion, but he felt that these living beings were slightly stronger than the ones before. Furthermore, their movements seemed to have a hint of Kai Fuzi making his own moves. However, this was clearly not the time to think too much. Kai Fuzi's heart moved, and he directly used the cultivation method that he had just created. As his power surged, his movements were swift, and with a few strikes, the living beings that pounced on him were killed. This effect was much weaker than when he casually crushed them, but Kai Fuzi was still very satisfied. Because, although the effect was weaker, he still finished off his opponent in one move, and did not affect the outcome of the battle at all. Apart from that, his body did not feel as exhausted as before because he had plundered too much. Instead, it was because of the surging power. It replenished a little of the foundation that had been plundered previously. How could he not be satisfied with such a strong contrast? Kai-Fuzi shouted, and pounced into the midst of those living beings, killing them one by one. His killing efficiency was extremely high. In just a short 2 hours, he had killed all of the hundreds of thousands of living beings on the battlefield, and he was the only one left on the battlefield. This is it. This should be considered a pass, right? Kai-Fuzi looked at the empty surroundings and could not help but mutter to himself. After continuously using his cultivation method during the 2 hours of battle, his body had completely recovered to its peak. In other words, he had recovered the basic standards of this world. Just as Kai-Fuzi was frowning and waiting, there was a ripple, and living beings appeared out of thin air on this battlefield. The many corpses that had originally been on this battlefield. At this moment, they suddenly turned from corporeal to illusory, and gradually disappeared. Soon, the entire battlefield was filled with hundreds of thousands of living beings. It looked exactly the same as when Kai-Fuzi had first arrived. Kai-Fuzi frowned and thought to himself, this still isn't considered a pass? No matter how many come, they will only be killed. They cannot pose any threat to me. What's the point of this test? Are you trying to test my patience? He thought in confusion. Luo Fan looked at the scene in the light from the cave abode, and only smiled faintly. How could his test be so simple? If Kai-Fuzi really thought that he could pass the test just by killing like this, he was probably going to be disappointed. Kai-Fuzi seemed to look down on Luo Fan's test, but he still had to take it seriously. However, he had no choice but to take this seriously, so he took the initiative to charge into the crowd of people and slaughter them. This slaughter caused his expression to change drastically. Because he had already discovered it. These were clearly living beings that had just been resurrected, but they were nearly twice as powerful as before. It wasn't that their bodies were twice as powerful, but that their battle techniques were much more powerful than before, causing their strength to double. Kai-Fuzi could even faintly feel traces of himself from the attacks of those living beings, and the aura of the cultivation method he had created. Kai-Fuzi was instantly bewildered. Is he absorbing the profundity of my attacks? If that's the case, won't they become stronger the more I kill? What happened next confirmed Kai-Fuzi's guess. When Kai-Fuzi once again easily killed off these hundreds of thousands of living beings, the living beings that were resurrected obtained some of Kai-Fuzi's battle techniques, and their overall strength was nearly twice as powerful as before. After 2 such advancements, they were no longer as defenseless against the float as before. Kai-Fuzi's methods were subtle and profound, and contained all sorts of inconceivable principles. He could use his own strength to mobilize thousands or even tens of thousands of times more power to attack. However, this kind of attack wasn't unlimited. When his opponents were weak, this kind of attack was naturally successful. But when their opponents became stronger, this kind of attack was gradually blocked. This kind of blocking made it even more difficult for Kai-Fuzi this time, and he even suffered many injuries before he could completely kill these hundreds of thousands of enemies. In the process, he had to create some new moves and cultivation methods to fight against the enemies. As a result, the strength of those resurrected beings increased once again. They even mastered the cultivation methods and techniques that they had to recreate in order to defeat their opponents. This finally broke through Kai-Fuzi's limit. Finally, Kai-Fuzi was besieged by the hundreds of thousands of living beings. After killing more than half of them, he was besieged to death by the remaining living beings. Even his corpse couldn't be preserved. It completely turned into nothingness. The moment Kai-Fuzi died, another Kai-Fuzi appeared at the resurrection point where he had been resurrected in the past. This resurrected Kai-Fuzi seemed to have lost some of his memories. His eyes became blank. I seem to have died, but how did I die? Why can't I think of anything? He thought. His eyes suddenly became sharp. I'll lose my memories when I die. My opponents will die, but they will obtain my battle techniques. If this goes on, won't I eventually become the same as those creatures in this world? I'll become ignorant and unconscious, and I'll sink into oblivion forever. No matter what, he was a level 8 pseudo-saint with profound wisdom. Needless to say, his mind was strong. However, he wouldn't be so arrogant as to think that he wouldn't die even if his opponents kept getting stronger. What exactly is this world testing? Kaifuzi frowned and thought. He had participated in some level 9 pseudo-saint tests, and heard of some level 9 pseudo-saint tests. Among them, almost all of the tests could be passed with just a glance. However, there had never been a test like the one that Luo Fan gave him. He couldn't understand it at all. He didn't know how to break out of this world at all. Kill all the living beings in this world? I can resurrect infinitely here. I can't kill them all. Could it be that there's a passage to another world somewhere in this world? That's not possible. This world is so big. If I want to search every inch of it, I'll need tens of thousands of years. It's just one of so many worlds. It's impossible to waste so much time, Kaifuzi thought. Just as he was thinking, a wave flashed, and he was thrown into another battlefield. This battlefield was different from the one he had killed in the previous few cycles. This battlefield was much bigger than the previous one, and there were more living beings in it. However, just like the other battlefields, the living beings in this battlefield were all living beings that had been upgraded. Each of them had the battle technique of Kaifuzi. They could also unleash power that was dozens or even hundreds of times stronger than their own. After discovering this, although Kaifuzi still had the strength, he didn't dare to kill them like he did before. He could only use mysterious footwork and didn't attack. He just kept avoiding those living beings. Those living beings didn't actually target Kaifuzi. Each of them was an individual, and each of them represented their own faction. Everyone else was their enemy, their opponent. So, Kaifuzi dodged like this, but no one chased after him. It was just that wherever he went, the surrounding living beings would attack him. In this way, he felt much more relaxed. However, he had enough time to think about what the test was and how he should pass it. Just what is this test trying to test? Kaifuzi wondered. Unknowingly, he had already left the battlefield. Although this world was strange, it was still a complete world. There were all sorts of strange terrains in this world. There were rivers, lakes, seas, mountains, plains, grasslands, deserts, snowy mountains. These terrains also created all sorts of battlefield. The battlefield that Kaifuzi first appeared in was a grassland. The battlefield that he appeared in for the first time was a desert. This time, the battlefield that he appeared in was a barren desert. I have to see this world completely to figure out how to pass this test, Kaifuzi thought as he looked at the void. His current body didn't have the ability to fly. However, with his current strength, he was still far from being able to fly as a cultivator. However, who was Kaifuzi? As an existence that could create and destroy worlds at will, even if he became an ordinary person weaker than a baby, he could still find a way to fly if he wanted to. Moreover, he now had power that was several times stronger than an ordinary adult. With a single thought, he mobilized the powers around him with his will. The powers inside and outside of his body resonated with each other and pushed against each other. In the end, his body suddenly shot up into the sky. He shot up several thousand meters into the sky and began to look in all directions. Chapter 1397. In a certain location in this vast and boundless world, there was a towering mountain that seemed to connect the heavens and the earth. It stood like a pillar that supported the heavens. This mountain was extremely far away from where he was. Kaifuzi looked around and found that each of the 3,600 resurrection points was extremely far away from that mountain. Moreover, from each resurrection point to that mountain, one had to pass through at least 1,000 extremely large battlefields. Even on that mountain, there was a battlefield at every step all the way to the clouds. It was so high that even Kaifuzi couldn't see it from midair. Given such a unique scene, even an ordinary person could guess that to pass this test, one had to ascend to the peak of that mountain, let alone a pseudo-saint like Kai Bozi. After understanding how to pass the test, Kai Bozi was no longer at a loss. His figure slowly descended. Although he could fly, his body did not give him the ability to do so. Flying like this, for him, required a lot of energy. Moreover, his speed was not as fast as if he was traveling on the ground. In comparison, was there a need to say more about which choice he should make? The sky in this world seemed to have the effect of obscuring one's vision. After descending to the ground, he raised his head to look at where the mountain was, but all he could see was the vast sky. He could no longer see the towering mountain peak that pierced through the clouds and connected the sky with the earth. This is simply a trap. If I didn't fly into the sky, wouldn't I have to wait countless years to travel the entire world to find that mountain? Kai Bozi looked at the changes in the sky. He could not help but feel helpless. At this moment, another creature pounced at him. He casually swatted it, smashing it into powder and meat paste. Then, he quickly used his wondrous footwork. In a few moves, he had already left his original position. After a few more turns, he quickly rushed out of the battlefield. There were many living beings on this battlefield. Even Kai Bozi's movements were swift and elegant. His methods were brutal and decisive, but it was impossible for him not to be stopped by the other living beings. As a result, this journey was filled with blood. Even Kai Bozi. He could not help but gradually be stained with blood. His entire body gradually turned into a bloody man. If I go in this direction, there will be more obstacles. Is this Luo Xun's hint? Kai Fuzi thought to himself. His expression was a little strange. Through the obstructions encountered while rushing in this direction, Kai Bozi soon discovered that it was easier to encounter obstructions in the direction of the mountain peak. For a moment, his heart surged, but he understood Luo Fan's plan. In his heart, he felt that Luo Fan's test was a scam. There was a hint that one didn't need to fly into the sky to see the existence of the mountain. This was already considered a hope of passing the test. Although the difficulty of this test was a little high, there was no shortcut at all compared to the previous test. They could only use time to endure, but it was much better. The fighting technique of driving a bobber was beyond imagination. Very soon, he passed through the obstruction of the living beings on the battlefield and left. After leaving the battlefield, he was not at a loss. He chose the location of the mountain and quickly rushed over. Although he had unleashed his body's potential to the limit, the speed he could reach was unimaginably fast. However, that mountain was too far away from here. Even if he rushed over without any obstruction, with his speed, he would need at least 10 years to reach there. Moreover, there were many battlefields on the way, which increased the time it would take him to reach that mountain. Perhaps, if everything went smoothly, he would need around 20 years to reach there. If he climbed to the peak of the mountain through the battlefields, he might need a few more years to reach the peak. Roughly speaking, if he wanted to pass Luo Fan's first test, he would need 30 to 40 years. When he thought of this, Kai Fuzi knew that Luo Fan was not lying when he said he would give him 100 years to pass this test. In this world, no living beings needed to eat, drink, or defecate. This world would naturally replenish all the living beings' consumption. All they needed to do was fight, fight, and fight. All the living beings in this world were born from that resurrection point. As soon as they were born, they were already at the peak of their prime. As soon as they appeared, they were thrown into the battlefields to fight against other living beings that had the same strength, speed, and skills as them. Because of this, almost no living being could live for more than a year. Not even 1 in a billion could live for more than 10 years. Therefore, when Kai Fuzi walked in this world, all he saw were living beings in their prime. Apart from that, there was nothing else. The age composition of these living beings made it so that no matter how real, mysterious, or similar this world was, Kai Fuzi knew clearly that this was not a naturally formed world. In fact, this was not a world that could exist in a normal state. Kai Fuzi's speed was relatively fast. In just 3 short years, he had passed through tens of thousands of battlefields, and the number of creatures he had encountered was in the hundreds of billions. As he moved forward, the closer he got to that mountain peak, the more clearly he felt that the fighting skills of those living beings were superb, and the more difficult it was for him to avoid them. On this day, 3 years after he had set his goal, Kai Fuzi finally discovered that those living beings who were originally in a chaotic battle were now consciously targeting him. Although everyone didn't stop fighting because Kai Fuzi entered the battlefield, as long as Kai Fuzi entered the battlefield of some living beings, those living beings who were originally fighting would naturally shift their target to Kai Fuzi. Opponents who originally wanted to tear him to shreds and swallow him had now become close teammates. Kai Fuzi, who was originally a complete stranger, had now become the target of their hatred and anger. After killing such opponents a few times, Kai Fuzi gradually understood that he had entered a new stage of the test. In other words, the distance he had advanced had crossed a certain boundary and he had begun to step into the second stage of the test. Kai Fuzi was nervous when he understood this. He was excited, perturbed. It was because after going through the tests over the years, he had become more and more aware that the test set by Luo Fan was not simple. The second stage of the test was much more difficult than the first stage. It was unknown whether he would die a few times because of this test, and become excited. Since the test had been upgraded, it meant that he was walking in the right direction, on the right path. Although he was already being targeted, Kai Fuzi's strength was still shocking. Although they encountered some difficulties, it wasn't too difficult for them to charge through the battlefield in the end. Just like that, another 3 years passed. Kai Fuzi entered another battlefield. This time, all the hundreds of thousands of living beings on the battlefield were looking at him. Their gazes gradually turned red, revealing a cruel blood-red color. This change made him realize that he had already stepped into the third stage of the test. As expected, at this moment, those living beings started to pounce at Kai Fuzi, and started to attack him with all sorts of martial arts that he had used before. Because there were too many of them, there were only a dozen or so living beings that came into contact with Kai Fuzi at any given moment. That was why Kai Fuzi could easily destroy them each time. However, there were just too many of them. They were endless, surging forward endlessly. After killing one batch, another batch would appear. If it wasn't for Kai Fuzi's ability to continuously circulate his energy to recover his strength during the process of attacking, he might have been killed and annihilated by the numerous living beings in just a short period of time. As long as I destroy them, I'll be able to pass this battlefield, Kai Fuzi thought to himself. Although there were too many living beings around him to count, he was still filled with fighting spirit. As he fought, he used all sorts of wondrous technique. The power he displayed as he moved was truly powerful enough for anyone interested in martial arts to worship him. Suddenly, Kai Fuzi felt that something was wrong. I've killed at least tens of millions of living beings. Why are there still enemies attacking me now? After this thought flashed through his mind, he suddenly froze. Then, an indescribable gloominess appeared on his face. This was because he realized that he had killed at least 10 opponents who were attacking him now. It couldn't be any more obvious. While he was killing those living beings were resurrecting one after another, joining the battle and pouncing towards him. Knowing this change, the Bobber knew that his response was wrong. At that moment, he withstood the powerful attacks and walked forward step by step. Just like that, he spent a few days before he finally crossed this battlefield. However, even after crossing this battlefield, those living beings were no longer restrained by the battlefield like before. Instead, they chased after him without a care for the battlefield. Realizing this, Kai Fuzi had no choice but to cheat. His figure moved, and he directly flew into the sky. He rushed into the air and broke away from the pursuit of the many creatures. After rushing into the sky, he instantly saw a mountain peak in the distance. Compared to the mountain peak he saw last time, he felt that the mountain peak seemed to have doubled in size. Evidently, the distance between him and the mountain peak had shortened by almost half. Kai Fuzi felt both helpless and happy when he understood this. He felt helpless because so many years had passed, but he was only halfway there. However, he was happy because he was at least halfway there. After lamenting for a while, Kai Fuzi looked down. He realized that those living beings were looking up at him with bloodshot eyes. He could not help but tremble, and he finally gave up on the idea of descending to continue his journey. In comparison, although flying in the void was very exhausting, it was not too fast. Their speed wasn't too fast, but they were able to avoid being hunted down by so many people. In comparison, it was already the best choice. Therefore, Kai Fuzi changed his mode of travel to flying and began to fly towards the mountain peak that towered into the clouds. Flying like this allowed Kai Fuzi to feel a rare sense of peace again. Every time he passed by a battlefield, he could see countless living beings looking at him as if they wanted to tear him apart and swallow him. However, he did not need to fight anymore. He flew like this for another 3 years. Because he did not need to encounter any battles, compared to before, the distance Kai Fuzi had traveled in these 3 years was several times more. It was several times more than before. After 3 years, he had already arrived at a position extremely close to that mountain peak. When he arrived here and looked up, he could see that there was a mountain peak in front of him that was like a canopy in the sky. It stood in front of him. He looked forward. It seemed that he could only see this mountain peak from all directions. He could no longer see the world behind the mountain peak. One could imagine how huge this mountain peak was. However, after arriving here, Kai Fuzi had no choice but to stop again, because, after arriving here, he saw that in front of him, there were countless living beings floating in the air, quietly waiting for him. Impressively, these living beings had actually unknowingly learned to fly. They had already obtained the same strength as Kai Fuzi. Kai Fuzi had already expected such a thing to happen, but he was not too surprised. He sighed. As expected, I have no choice but to fight. As he said this, he shouted softly and pounced forward, suddenly crashing into that group of people, and began to fight. Luo Fan saw all of Kai Fuzi's actions, but at this moment, he shook his head inwardly. His brain is still a little rigid. Originally, he only needed to break through the barrier of the sky to pass the test, but now he actually spent so much time rushing to the heavenly peak. In the test that he had set, more than 10 years had passed. But in Luo Fan's cave abode, less than 3 days had passed. In these 3 days, he looked at Kai Fuzi's various actions and choices, but he was a little disappointed. Although the test that he had set was to test the fighting strength of the same strength and the same state, it was more to test how he could find a possible direction in an impossible situation. And the result was very obvious. Under the situation of the same body and the same strength, Kai Fuzi's fighting strength was indeed extremely strong, and indeed showed the strength of a level 8 pseudo-saint living being. But on the other hand, in terms of finding a way to pass the test, Kai Fuzi's ability to fight was rather poor. Luo Fan thought a little helplessly. Looks like if the test of the treasure seizing gathering was a little more obscure, he wouldn't be able to help me much. With this thought, he slowly closed his eyes, and no longer had the mood to pay attention to Kai Fuzi. Kai Fuzi did not know that his performance had already thoroughly disappointed Luo Fan. At this time, he was still using all of his various body's potential, and using all of his fighting techniques to the limit. He continuously killed living being after living being, and continuously eliminated batch after batch of opponents that blocked his way, continuously advancing towards the towering mountain that reached into the clouds. This went on for another year. Only then did Kai Buozi finally break through the barrier of countless flying creatures and truly set foot on the land of that mountain. The moment he set foot on the mountain, Kai Fuzi felt refreshed, as if everything about him had been raised to a higher level, and the value of his life had been reflected. Occasionally participating in the test is indeed beneficial to cultivation, he thought to himself. With this thought, he raised his head to look at the mountain, and could not help but show a look of anticipation on his face. Just what is at the top of the mountain? Was it a door of light, a teleportation array, or another world? No matter how tall the mountain was, it could not compare to the terrifying distance that he had sensed from a certain resurrection point. Hence, to him, no matter how many battles there were on the mountain, no matter how powerful the resistance was, to him, the peak of the mountain was already in front of him. At this moment, the surrounding living beings seemed to sense his arrival. Instantly, the sounds of killing shook the heavens. Many living beings fiercely pounced towards him, and the color of blood in their eyes was so dense that it was like blood that could not be assimilated. Sensing these living beings pouncing towards him, Kai-Fuzi finally stopped looking forward to it, and began to once again throw himself into the slaughter. He began to continuously fight against the many living beings. Although the strength and speed of the living beings on the mountain were no different from those from other places, their fighting techniques had already reached a level where they could even compare to Kai-Fuzi. As they waved their hands, Kai-Fuzi felt an incomparably huge pressure. There were even a few times when Kai-Fuzi's entire body was almost smashed into meat paste. Just like that, Kai-Fuzi advanced towards the peak of the mountain with great difficulty. Because the fighting techniques of the living beings he was fighting were similar to his, he was forced to create more and more exquisite methods to deal with their attacks. He had no choice but to constantly think about how to kill his opponent more efficiently. This made him. He was able to utilize his body more and more effectively, allowing him to become more and more familiar with the combat techniques of this body. Originally, when he fought, he could only use strength that was a few thousand times that of his body. But later on, he could use various methods. He could unleash strength that was hundreds of thousands of times that of his body. This kind of strength, in other places, even if it bombarded a mountain, it was enough to completely shatter and collapse the entire mountain. But here, it could be easily blocked by the numerous living beings. Even if it bombarded the mountain, it could only cause some mountain rocks to fall. Apart from that, there was no other effect. There seemed to be a special resurrection point on this mountain. This resurrection point could completely resurrect the dead living beings on the mountain in an instant, and directly throw them into the many battlefields on this mountain, joining in the pursuit of Kai-Fuzi. Thus, the numerous living beings attacking Kai-Fuzi became endless. Finally, at a certain moment, a year after he set foot on the mountain, Kai-Fuzi was hit by a living being's attack in a moment of carelessness. In an instant, Kai-Fuzi directly collapsed, turning into a pile of meat paste. Then, in the next moment, Kai-Fuzi directly resurrected at the resurrection point on this mountain. Every time he resurrected, Kai-Fuzi would lose a bit of his memory. This time, he lost all his memories after he set foot on this mountain. In a trance, he felt as if he had just set foot on this mountain. I must have lost a lot of memories. In an instant, Kai-Fuzi understood. After all, he was not stupid. He clearly felt that he had created countless cultivation methods that could make use of this body to unleash unimaginable power. After thinking for a while, he knew that he must have set foot on this mountain for a very long time and encountered strong resistance on this mountain. Only then would he waste his energy to create so many cultivation methods. Just as he was thinking about this, there was a flash of fluctuation, and his figure was sent to a battlefield. This battlefield was at the foot of the mountain. It could be said that as soon as he set foot on this mountain, he would inevitably appear on this battlefield. The massacre began once again. Just like that, Kai-Fuzi spent more than 30 years, and died more than 20 times before he finally broke through the barriers of many battlefields. He crossed the height of this mountain that was close to the distance between heaven and earth, and rushed to the top of the mountain to see the scene that he had always been looking forward to at the top of the mountain. The moment he saw this scene, An inexplicable bitter smile appeared on Kai Fuzi's face. This was because he realized that at the top of this mountain, several tens of feet above his head, there was a thin film that covered the entire sky above this world. That thin film revealed all sorts of strange lights and shadows. That was another world. So, I don't even need to come to the top of this mountain. As long as I'm in this world, I can break through this world by flying up and rush into another world. At this moment, Kai Fuzi's heart was filled with dispiritedness. He stood there blankly, looking up at the other world close at hand. In a trance, he already understood the true meaning behind Luo Fan's test. Chapter 1398. Just as Kai Fuzi comprehended something, Luo Fan, who was in the cave abode, suddenly felt something. He instantly sensed what was happening in the many worlds, and an indescribable expression appeared on his face. Although it's a little slow, it's still something. It seems like it's not completely useless, Luo Fan thought to himself. He focused his attention back into the world and watched as Kai Fuzi continued to participate in the test. In the first world, after Kai Fuzi made up his mind, he leaped up and crashed into the strange world barrier above. In that instant, he felt as if he had passed through a layer of water. Suddenly, his body felt light. Then, he felt boundless power descend upon his body. His cultivation realm that had been sealed for more than 10 years had returned. His power, his senses, everything had reached his peak state. This feeling of being filled with power made Kai Fuzi feel inexplicably relaxed and joyful. Only after losing something would one know how to cherish it. For so many years, he couldn't control his power at all. His cultivation realm was restricted to an almost non-existent level. To him, it was an extremely painful experience, and he didn't want to experience it again in his life. He entered a brand new world. It was a boundless starry sky. The entire world was pitch black, dotted with stars. Boundless starry essence filled his surroundings, and there were layers upon layers of ripples that swept past where he was, wanting to grasp all changes in the entire universe. If he hadn't been extremely vigilant and made a move the moment his power and cultivation realm returned, he might not have been able to do so. Perhaps these fluctuations were already enough to completely grasp everything about him, causing him to no longer have any secrets on him. How is this possible? It's just a world created by Senior Luozun. How can such a powerful force be born? Although Kai Fuzi wasn't completely grasped by the ripples, he was still astonished by the existence of these ripples. These ripples were simply too powerful. They were so powerful that they were comparable to the power of a level 9 pseudo-saint. As a test world created by a level 9 venerable, it was simply impossible for such a level of power to exist in this world. And now, such a thing had happened directly. One could only imagine how shocking this boomerang was. Kai Fuzi was shocked. What he didn't know was that this universe was created by Luo Fan by simulating that technological universe. The civilization within such a universe wasn't a cultivation civilization, but rather a technological civilization. Such a technological civilization was fundamentally different from the cultivation civilization. However, the power that it could control could be superimposed. It could condense countless weak powers and superimpose them to produce an effect. Although this power had reached the 9th grade pseudo-saint realm, it did not mean that a 9th grade pseudo-saint realm existence was required to gather such a powerful power. Therefore, there was no need for Kai Fu to be so shocked. Kai Fuzi naturally didn't know this. After discovering the level of these fluctuations, he was even more grateful for his previous caution. He merged his perception with the universe in an extremely obscure way. It slowly spread out and gradually spread to all the stars in the universe. It carefully sensed the situation of the many stars, looking for the living beings in the universe, looking for the strange existence that was emitting all kinds of fluctuations. After all, it was a level 8 pseudo-saint. The current Kai Fuzi was more than 1 billion times stronger than when Luo Fan encountered that technological universe. Back then, Luo Fan could clearly sense the specific situation of the entire universe with his own power, let alone the current Kai Fuzi. In just a few breaths' time, the situation of the entire universe was absorbed by Kai Fuzi's senses. In an instant, Kai Fuzi knew the truth of this universe. For a moment, the shock on his face lessened slightly. However, a look of admiration replaced the shock on his face. It appeared on his face. As a native cultivator of the Devil Realm, Kai Fuzi's understanding of the world was limited to the Devil Realm. To him, a truly high-end world was a world with a powerful cultivation civilization. A technological civilization, a divine path civilization, a crystal civilization, and all sorts of other civilizations. None of them could compare to a powerful cultivation civilization. At this moment, the level of the technological civilization that appeared in front of him far exceeded his understanding of technological civilizations. The various technological methods revealed had even completely replaced the things that he had originally imagined could only be done by the true cultivation civilization. For example, reincarnation, creation, and so on. Rebirth of the physical body, the use of rules and laws, and so on and so forth. All sorts of mysterious and powerful techniques were an eye-opener for him. He felt as if a boundless world was slowly opening up in front of him. With such a feeling, it was easy to imagine how much he admired Luo Fan, who had brought all of this. Riding the buoy, he took a light step forward, and his figure had already arrived in the territory of a technologically advanced country. When Luo Fan created this world, he incorporated the various systems of that technological civilization into it. Therefore, the countries in this universe were not much different from that universe. Moreover, because Luo Fan's current cultivation realm was many times stronger than before, the technological level of the universe he created was a few levels higher than that of the universe he created back then. Back then, the technological products of that universe could only affect Tao Venerables. However, the technological civilization of this universe could even affect level 9 false saints. Kai Fuzi was already a level 8 false saint and could travel anywhere in this universe. However, he was still lacking when it came to the areas that were truly heavily guarded. If he dared to barge into those areas without any precautions, what awaited him would be the absolute strongest attack of those countries. Obviously, Kaizi recognized this point. Hovering outside the country, he looked at the technological creation in the middle of the country that posed a threat to him. Kai Fuzi had learned his lesson from the previous world. After coming to this world, he no longer acted recklessly. Instead, he planned to try his best to understand the state of this universe before finding a way to break through it. Kai Fuzi was a level 8 false saint. Normally speaking, no universe would be able to form a shackle on him, nor would it be able to seal and restrict him. As long as he was willing, even in the demon realm. In the Earth's universe, he could break through the world's restrictions at will and leave the demon realm or the Earth's universe. However, in this universe, his unrestricted nature could not be used at all. As long as he had the thought of forcefully breaking through the barrier of this world, there would naturally be a force descending to dispel this thought and eliminate the power he gathered for this thought. After this happened a few times, Kai Fuzi naturally understood that this was Luo Zun's intention. If he wanted to pass the test, he had to break through the restrictions of this world according to the normal procedure. If he wanted to flip the table, that was absolutely not allowed. Because of this, he had no choice but to come here. He planned to gain a deeper understanding of this universe from this country and then break through the shackles of this world according to the route that Luo Fan had set. To enter the next world's test. Kai Fuzi floated in this position for a full 3 months. After 3 months, his body trembled, and the aura around his body underwent a subtle change. In the blink of an eye, he no longer looked like a cultivator. Instead, He looked more like a powerful life that belonged to a technological civilization in this universe. This change was not just on the surface. Instead, from the inside to the outside, everything that belonged to Kai Fuzi had changed. After doing all this, Kai Fuzi swaggered into the territory of that country. In an instant, layers of ripples swept through his body. They even swept through the smallest part of his body countless times, categorizing and comparing all of his information and secret, analyzing. After a while, these ripples receded and he was completely treated as an ordinary life in this country. The country that Kai Fuzi chose was a country where ordinary life could live freely in the void of the universe because of all kinds of technological product. In such a country, Kai Fuzi flew through the void of the universe without any protection. However, it did not seem out of place at all. After encountering a few waves of people and moving around a few times, Kai Fuzi no longer left any traces that he did not belong to this country. This test is quite interesting. After completely concealing his identity, Kai Fuzi could not help but feel that it was quite interesting. Kai Fuzi had never experienced such an experience before. Suddenly having such an experience was clearly an extremely novel experience for him. Using the various modes of transportation in this country, Kai Fuzi arrived at a powerful technological creation at the center of this country in just a few days, hundreds of millions of light years away from where he was before. The powerful technological creation of this country was a terrifying existence that could create and destroy world. Such an existence was protected by countless world. It could be said that the most powerful defense in the entire country was itself. It did not need any other power, materials, or weapons to protect its existence. That was why Kai Fuzi could arrive here so easily and see this technological creation. These countless worlds were a huge problem for all creatures in the technological civilization. However, for Kai Fuzi, who came from the cultivation civilization, its defense was not much stronger than a piece of tissue. This did not mean that the cultivation civilization was much stronger than the technological civilization. It was just that the cultivation civilization had more research on man-made world. In particular, Kai Fuzi cultivated the space-time Tao, which was a Tao that was closely related to the world. It was natural that he could treat these countless worlds as fragile as a piece of paper. With a thought, Kai Fuzi easily passed through the stages according to his understanding of the world. Not long after, he had already passed through the barriers of the world and directly arrived in front of the technological creation, seeing it with his own eyes. It was an existence that looked like a crystal ball. However, it was as big as a huge star. When it created a world, it directly split out the shadow of a crystal ball and condensed it in the void. In the end, it produced a shocking explosion, giving birth to many things that were either strong or weak, or had all sorts of magical uses. Some of them even came out of seemingly ordinary world. The moment Kai Fuzi looked at the crystal ball shook slightly. Instantly, a huge human face appeared in front of Kai Fuzi. "You are not a being from this universe." Kai Fuzi was shocked, but he quickly understood. How could an existence that was comparable to a level 9 pseudo-sage not have intelligence? He slowly gathered his power, ready to attack or break through the barrier to escape at any time. He said, "I am indeed from another world. What do you plan to do? What is your goal?" The huge face said. It did not attack directly, which made Kai Fu heave a sigh of relief even though he was curious. Although he was already prepared to fight, he was still not confident. He was facing an existence that was comparable to a level 9 pseudo-sage. Even if he was confident that he could escape. However, it would be best if there was peace. Thus, Kai Fuzi said, "Break through this universe and leave it. Do you have any ideas?" Hearing Kai Fuzi's answer, the face seemed to be relieved. "You want to leave this universe? That's too simple. There is a strange wormhole at the center of the universe. As long as you enter it, you will naturally be able to leave this universe." "Wormhole?" Kai Fuzi frowned. After all, he was a cultivator born and raised in the cultivation civilization. He had no idea what a wormhole was. The face did not have any intention of explaining to Kai Fuzi. After saying that, the crystal ball suddenly blasted out a shadow of a crystal ball, wrapped around the float, and shrunk. With a single explosion, a savage world was born within 100 years. Carrying Kai Fuzi, it rushed out, crossing an unknown number of light years, and directly went outside that country. Then, the world shook slightly. It disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if it had never existed. How straightforward! Kai Fuzi felt helpless. The reason why he was blasted out so easily just now was naturally not because the technological creation was so powerful that it could crush him at will. Rather, it was because the crystal ball did not have any malicious intent and its attack was extremely covert. In the blink of an eye, that world had already carried Kai Fuzi across an unknown number of light years. If the technological creation had any malicious intent, Kai Fuzi would naturally be able to sense it and react instantly. Perhaps he would still end up in a very sorry state, but at least the situation would not be as easy as before. Kai Fuzi sensed it slightly and sensed the center of the entire universe. He saw a huge, pitch-black vortex that looked like a star. Combined with the name wormhole, he understood. Is this a wormhole? Such a violent existence can really lead to another world? Although he did not understand, Kai Fuzi was not a simple-minded person. Since he did not understand, he would learn. Wouldn't it be better if he learned until he understood? As a powerful level 8 pseudosage, Kai Fuzi's learning ability did not need much to be said. Using his senses, he could even sense the center of the universe that was billions of light years away. Sensing the many living beings in other countries in the universe, as well as the many carriers of technological knowledge, was naturally an extremely easy thing to do. With such a strong learning ability and such a large number of learning materials, how could technological knowledge be an obstacle for him? Over the next year, Kai Fuzi floated in the void and frantically learned all kinds of technological knowledge recorded in the universe. At first, Kai Fuzi only wanted to understand whether the wormhole could allow him to transcend this world and go to another world to learn this knowledge. However, the more he learned, the more he felt that this technological civilization was vast and profound. He could also sense that the existence of this technological civilization could be of great benefit to his cultivation and cultivation. This made him unknowingly become addicted to it, and he became more and more immersed in the technological knowledge of this technological civilization. He even faintly forgot his original intention. Kai Fuzi's changes in this world were seen bit by Luo Fan. When he saw that Kai Fuzi was immersed in the technological knowledge and could not extricate himself, he could not help but shake his head. Still not strong enough, although the wormhole was profound, with Kai Fuzi's ability. If it was just to understand the mysteries of this wormhole, to find out if he could leave this universe through impulse, and to find a way to leave this universe through the wormhole, he would not even need a month. He would definitely be able to find it within 3 to 5 days. Now, he was actually still immersed in it after a year. It was obvious that the knowledge of the technological civilization had confused his Tao heart, and he had even forgotten his priorities. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. Although he's a cultivation genius, he still lacks experience. It's extremely difficult for such a cultivator to become a level 9 false sage, let alone become a sage. However, he did not throw these worlds aside, nor did he do anything to remind Kai Fuzi. He did not throw these worlds aside because he had already developed some interest in the process of clearing the levels with Kai Fuzi. It was like watching a movie wanting to see the result. As for not reminding Kai Fuzi, that was even simpler. Kai Fuzi was not his disciple, so why would he waste his energy to teach him cultivation? Kai Fuzi did not know that Luo Fan was slightly disappointed in him. However, He eagerly absorbed the vast amount of scientific and technological knowledge. He even constantly tried to integrate the vast amount of scientific and technological knowledge into his path of cultivation. He wanted his cultivation path to be able to combine the advantages of the two civilizations, the cultivation civilization and the technological civilization, to become stronger and smoother. Although his hard work was seen by Luo Fan as not doing proper work, and as a sign that his Tao heart was unstable, it was not impossible for him to produce results. Through his hard work, he managed to create all sorts of special divine abilities and special technique. He faintly combined the profundities of the cultivation civilization and the technological civilization. This produced an effect that was far greater than 1+1, and made his strength visibly increase compared to before. After tasting this sweetness, Kai Fuzi was encouraged. He became even more immersed in the vast amount of technological knowledge, gradually forgetting the passage of time, gradually forgetting his purpose in coming to this universe. Of course, perhaps to him, this kind of gain was even more important than passing Luo Fan's test and being recommended by Luo Fan to participate in the Tao discussion. In this state, Kai Fuzi floated in the void for a full 10 years before he finally woke up, unsatisfied. In these 10 years, he had learned almost all the technological knowledge in the entire universe. Moreover, by combining these scientific and technological knowledge with his own cultivation path, he created more than 3,000 kinds of wonderful magical abilities, which made his strength 10% stronger than when he first participated in Luo Fan's test. Kai Fuzi raised his hand, and a planetary fortress completely formed from time and space appeared in his palm. It slowly rotated above his palm, and the time and space within it constantly changed intensely. As they flickered, they gave off an aura that could destroy the universe. This was one of the more than 3,000 divine abilities. It was a divine ability created by Kai Fuzi by combining his own Tao with a star fortress that could destroy the entire universe. Once this ability was activated, it could unleash a devastating blow that could completely destroy this entire technological universe. It could even destroy Kai Fuzi himself along the way. Feeling the terror of the planetary fortress in his hand, Kai Fuzi was secretly delighted. With this kind of gain, even if I failed the test this time, it's worth it. Luo Fan watched Kai Fuzi's movements from outside, and when he heard what he said in that world, he could not help but sigh. Neglecting the essentials for trifles, although the ability Kai Fuzi used was powerful, it did not help his cultivation realm at all. What was the point of this for a cultivator who sought to become a saint and pursue eternity? Chapter 1399. Although Luo Fan was a little disappointed with Kai Floater, who had almost forgotten that his participation in the Tao discussion would bring him more benefits, Luo Fan was still curious about how he would pass the trials. Therefore, he only thought about it in his heart and did not really shift his attention away from Kai Floater. Instead, he continued to quietly watch how Kai Floater would pass the trials. After Kai Floater had spent 10 years using his knowledge of science and technology to create all sorts of divine abilities, he finally remembered the reason why he had participated in the trials. Through his knowledge of science and technology, he naturally knew what a wormhole was. He understood that one could really leave this universe through a wormhole and pass the trials of this world. Kai Fuzi didn't waste any more time. Soon, he traversed the void and arrived at the center of the universe. As the center of the universe, even if it was a place of nothingness that originally had nothing special, it would definitely be noticed by many countries in this universe due to its unique location. Not to mention that there was a wormhole that led to other worlds and other universes. One could imagine how much the countries in this universe would fight for the defense of this location. It could be said that at every moment there were several wars erupting around this center of the universe. At every moment there were countless living beings dying in this center of the universe. Even their souls could not escape. A place with such tight defenses would definitely be on guard against the invasion of all living beings. Even though Kai Floater had already made all sorts of preparations and had an understanding of almost all the technological knowledge in this universe. But the moment he neared the center of the universe, he still felt dozens of waves sweep past his body, directly exposing him, who had originally been extremely well hidden. After the waves passed, Kai Floater felt an unknown amount of malice lock onto him. These malice, every single one of them came from a powerful weapon that could threaten him. If any of them hit him without holding back, it would be enough to make him lose half his life. Feeling the changes, Kai Floater was shocked. Suddenly, he came to a realization. The technological knowledge I've learned all these years isn't the most advanced technological knowledge in this universe. The truly advanced technological knowledge is around the center of this universe. At this moment, countless attacks were already exploding from all directions, raining down on him. In the blink of an eye, he felt an indescribably terrifying impact. Time, space, matter, and energy around him seemed to be completely sealed at this moment. In his daze, he felt as if death was about to befall him. This feeling was so obvious and so direct that it made him feel as if he was going to lose his life in the next moment. In this moment of imminent peril, Kai Fu Zi roared. The surrounding time and space were completely destroyed by him in an instant. As the space-time collapsed, his figure disappeared in an instant. Then, billions of worlds covered the surroundings and frantically surged out in all directions, replacing the larger and larger cosmos with more and more spaces. This caused the cosmos to gradually change its original appearance from the starry sky to that of a cluster of worlds. Suddenly, it changed from the universe to the world cluster. This instantaneous change was enough to completely block the endless attacks from the surroundings. The countless worlds completely engulfed the countless attacks, and the power of those attacks had indeed reached an unimaginable level. Even those worlds, after being swallowed by those attacks, were all shattered and destroyed. In the blink of an eye, the change in the state of the universe that had begun to gradually affect the entire cosmos was completely cut off. On top of that, it even spread the changes continuously. It caused the region that had originally become a cluster of worlds to revert to the appearance of a normal starry sky. After this change, the entire cosmos seemed to be completely the same as before. However, the powerful attacks that were originally aimed at Kai Fu Zi had completely disappeared, as if they had never appeared. The impact of that change just now was really too great. It was too shocking. The various changes that had occurred in that instant had a shocking destructive effect on matter existing in reality. Among them, the truly powerful countries that could even change the cosmos and space-time had extremely shocking defensive power, easily withstanding this kind of destruction. However, for the other countries that were not that powerful, this kind of destruction had already exceeded their endurance limit. They were directly annihilated in that destruction. Therefore, after this change, only a few of the many forces that originally existed around the center of the universe were left. And even these few forces were extremely terrified at this moment. Although they had already defended against the destructive effect, that was based on the foundation of their countries and not the judgment of the living beings that currently controlled those countries. The absolute change that Kai Fu Zi displayed in the instant that he had displayed to the entire universe really shocked those living beings to the point that they suspected that they had just seen an illusion. While those living beings from those countries were in a state of panic, Kai Fu Zi's figure had already appeared in front of the vortex that seemed to be the size of a star. This vortex had a boundless and terrifying suction force. That suction force targeted everything, including time and space. Based on such a suction force, if it was allowed to continue developing, perhaps the entire universe would be swallowed up by it and completely disappear. Perhaps because of this, there were countless strange instruments around the wormhole. Even Kai Buozi, who had learned almost all the knowledge in the entire universe, could not understand the layers of defense. This limited the suction force of the wormhole to a certain level, causing the suction force of the wormhole to be unable to spread without any hindrance. Standing outside the many instruments and looking at the wormhole that was surrounded by layers of defense, Kai Fu-Zi fell into a state of hesitation. Only when he really set foot here did he realize how terrifying the wormhole was. In the depths of the wormhole, there was indeed an aura that was incompatible with this universe and belonged to another world. However, in his senses, that aura was infinitely far away from him. Moreover, along the way there were countless obstacles that made him feel threatened. He was now a level 8 pseudo-saint who had mastered more than 3,000 types of technological divine abilities, so the existences that made him feel threatened were at least level 9 pseudo-saint. Even if there was only one such danger, it was enough to make him feel troubled, not to mention that there were so many layers of them. "This is going to kill me," Kai Fu-Zi muttered. He furrowed his brows deeply. At this moment, the various countries had recovered from their panic, and the boundless undulations had once again locked onto Kai Fu's position. When they discovered that Kai Fu-Zi had suddenly appeared outside the defense of the wormhole, they panicked once again. Such an unfathomable existence that could completely change the state of the entire universe suddenly appeared around a wormhole that could destroy the entire universe. One could imagine how dangerous it was. "May I know who you are? This is the center of the universe, and it is extremely dangerous. I hope that you can leave this place for the sake of the people in the universe. No matter what your request is, it can be discussed," one of the more impatient countries said directly. As they spoke, the other countries also reacted and also made a promise that any request could be negotiated. Kai Fu-Zi could only feel helpless when he heard this. Did they think that he was here to extort the many powerful countries of this universe? He could not be bothered with them. Although these people didn't say anything substantial, it was enough for Kai Fu-Zi to make up his mind. If he wanted to break through the barrier of this universe and complete Luo Xun's test, he had to enter that wormhole, no matter how dangerous that wormhole was. And he obviously had not given up on the idea. Therefore, Kai Fu-Zi turned his head and glanced at this universe that had given him a lot of benefit. He sighed slightly, lifted his foot, and charged into the layers of defense. These layers of defense were mainly against the wormhole, to prevent the wormhole's suction from spreading without limit. There was almost no defense against the outside world. This was also the main reason why those countries did not attack Kai Fu-Zi even though they were panicking because of his presence. Instead, they wanted to negotiate with Kai Fu-Zi. Such a defense naturally did not pose any threat to Kai Fu-Zi. He was very relaxed. He passed through layer after layer of defense, and in the blink of an eye, he had already charged into that wormhole. Such a scene caused the living beings in the many countries to stare with their mouths agape. Suddenly, someone said, "This person is committing suicide? This is suicide. Isn't it a little too classy?" Kai Fu-Zi naturally did not know that his actions were seen as suicide by the other living beings. At this moment, he felt the terrifying power of the wormhole acting on his body, pulling him from all directions. Even though he was a level 8 pseudo-saint, and his body was so strong that it was unimaginable to ordinary cultivators, he could not withstand such a terrifying tearing force. He felt as if his body had been divided into countless tiny particles, and he was only able to forcefully gather them together with his strong willpower and barely maintain his complete appearance. However, this state of using his willpower to gather his body could not last forever. If it was too long, he would still not be able to withstand it and would be torn into pieces by that terrifying power. By then, he would die, his soul would scatter from the outside. This wormhole looked like an incomparably dark whirlpool that even absorbed all light. However, when one actually charged into this wormhole, they saw a scene of flowing light. The endless light circulated within the wormhole. Some of these lights came from billions of years ago when the universe was born. Some came from more recent times, or even from just now, when Kai Fu Zi stood around the wormhole, thinking and hesitating. The many rays of light formed a bizarre and dazzling scene. It was as if the entire development process of the universe had been compressed and displayed in front of him at the same time. At first glance, it seemed to be extremely chaotic, but upon closer inspection, one would discover that the situation was extremely chaotic. It contained some kind of supreme laws of time and space, and it even contained profound mysteries that could allow one to become a level 9 pseudo-saint. The Bobber did not notice this at first. However, he was, after all, extraordinary. Very quickly, he was touched and discovered some details that he had neglected for a long time. He could not help but reveal a shocked expression on his face. He murmured, This is the direction of my future cultivation. At this moment, he even pulled out a little of his will that had gathered in one part of his body. His body suddenly expanded 10,000 times in that instant. At the same time, it was also 10,000 times thinner. Previously, when his body was still the size of a normal human body, it had the appearance of an incomparably real human body. But now, after it had expanded 10,000 times, he looked even more illusory than the souls of ordinary people, as if he did not exist. Currently, only those with truly great eyesight would be able to see that his current figure was still there, with his body suddenly becoming like this. Kai Fu Zi naturally could not keep his body from changing shape under the power of the wormhole. In an instant, his body, just like the boundless light in the surroundings, it began to revolve around the center of the wormhole in an eternal cycle. Round after round, it circulated with the light that had entered the wormhole since ancient times, circulating with every moment that entered the wormhole. All the light that belonged to the entire universe at this moment circulated together in a trance. He seemed to feel as if he had already transcended time and space, becoming an incredible existence that was no longer shackled and restricted by time and space. He seemed to have existed in every moment from ancient times to the present, as well as in every corner of the universe. Standing at any location in the universe, as long as one had enough eyesight, one could see everything in the entire universe by raising one's eyes and looking out. Deducing with this logic, it was obvious. Any light emitted from every location in this universe would definitely enter the black hole at the center of this universe. Therefore, the light that entered this black hole at every instant would definitely contain the light of all the space in the entire universe. In other words, if a corresponding method was used to separate the light that entered this wormhole at every instant, that would be a complete universe. Based on this logic, at this moment, the endless light that was circulating around a certain point with Kai Fu Zi in this wormhole was the gathering of the images of the universe at every instant since the birth of the ancient universe. Circulating and operating with these scenes, what was the difference between this feeling and transcending time and space? Kai Fu Zi quietly experienced this feeling. In a trance, he felt that the 9th step below sage that was extremely far away was suddenly pulled closer to him. In a trance, he had a feeling that he only needed to lift his foot slightly and he would be able to step onto that step and become a true level 9 false sage. Just as this feeling appeared, Kai Fu Zi suddenly came to his senses. At this moment, he discovered that the incomparably terrifying tearing force in this wormhole no longer posed any threat to him. His figure had completely recovered at some point, and he was still a lively Kai Fu Zi in the wormhole, naturally circling around a certain point in the depths of the wormhole. Luo Fan felt a little helpless when he saw the Bobber's performance. However, this helplessness was not due to his disappointment in his performance. Instead, it was due to his helplessness towards his heaven-defying luck. Kai Fu Zi could comprehend the next step of the spacetime path in the wormhole, but this was not arranged by him. In fact, although all the universes used as the test grounds were created by Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan did not completely set up the specific way to pass these universes. In fact, the way he created these universes was more based on the abstruse use of the second level of the law of cause and effect. The way these universes were formed was the effect of the law of cause and effect. Or, more specifically, it was the effect of the river of luck. What kind of dangers he would encounter, and what kind of harvest he would obtain in the process of clearing the levels. Although this was achieved with the help of Luo Fan, it was fundamentally his own luck. At this moment, Kai Fu-Zi could comprehend a deeper level of the spacetime path in the wormhole. This was also his luck. Suddenly, Luo Fan had a strange feeling. He could not help but frown. The test this time is a little strange. Why does it seem like it was specially made to bring benefits to Kai Fu-Zi? With this thought, Luo Fan's heart trembled. He started to activate the godly power that he had obtained when he participated in Wu Zun's Fate Union ceremony. The moment this godly power was activated, it was born out of nowhere in the depths of the chaotic state. The river of luck path that connected countless perfect worlds and vast worlds appeared before his eyes. Luo Fan already had the ability to sense the river of luck path. In particular, after he cut off a small part of the connection with the river of luck path, this sensing ability became stronger and clearer. This was not difficult to understand. For example, if one wanted to see the specific appearance of a river, if one sank to the bottom of the river, what one could see would be extremely limited. However, as long as one jumped out of the river, one would naturally be able to see the direction of the river clearly. However, this sensing ability was after all limited. At this moment, when he wanted to see the changes in the river of luck path, it was somewhat insufficient to rely on his sensing ability alone. Under such circumstances, the godly power that he had obtained from the Book Supreme became the best supplement for Luo Fan to observe the river of luck path. It was not that the power of that divine ability itself was much stronger than Luo Fan's own perception ability. It was that the method of observation used by this godly power was different from Luo Fan's sensing ability. These different methods of observation complemented and compensated for each other. It was like a person's two eyes that only saw a two-dimensional picture. However, when combined, it could form a three-dimensional effect. It could produce a huge and intense complementation, allowing Luo Fan to sense the river of luck path many times clearer than usual. This river of luck path was not restricted at this moment. It was extremely vast and connected the entire demon realm like an ocean. It even connected the entire Earth and the universe. While it appeared extremely grand, it also appeared extremely thin and difficult to see through. Luo Fan had already been mentally prepared for this appearance of the river of luck path. However, he was not surprised at this moment. He was not disappointed either. Relying on the connection between his own luck path and the river of luck path, he began to quietly sense the location of the connection point between him and the river of luck path. With his own luck path as a guide, finding the specific location of the river of luck path was as easy as finding the location of the fishing hook through the fishing line. Very soon, Luo Fan saw the point that was extremely closely connected to him at a certain location in the river of luck path. After discovering that point, Luo Fan's expression suddenly became extremely ugly. This was because he discovered that the point he was at was suffering from some kind of strange pressure from another point that was quite far away. This kind of pressure made it seem as if a certain existence in that point of his was being absorbed by another point, or rather replicated. Even though the point that was connected to his luck wasn't damaged or destroyed, there were many hindrances when it moved. It was as if every movement required the other point to move, and the other point needed to move as well. Luck path entrustment. Looking at the relationship between the 2 points, this term flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The scene in front of him was clearly a manifestation of someone entrusting luck path to his own luck path. Although Luo Fan did not have a deep understanding of the river of luck path, He could see at a glance that this connection caused all his actions to bring unexpected benefits to the living being whose luck path was connected to the other point. In fact, all of his actions would unknowingly bring benefits to someone else. After guessing the effect of the connection between the 2 points, how could Luo Fan not understand that the person corresponding to the other point was Kai Fuzi? The tests of the many universes that he had set up for Kai Fuzi were obviously due to this change, which was why Kai Fuzi could obtain so many benefits from them. Chapter 1400. Luo Fan's words were naturally directed at Kai Buozi. The current situation was naturally the most advantageous for Kai Buozi. Such an advantageous situation was clearly very targeted. This made Luo Fan suspect whether Kai Buozi had used some sort of method to manipulate his own luck to oppress Luo Fan's luck, thus causing Luo Fan to involuntarily create this situation. This is not impossible. Kai Buozi is a level 8 pseudo-saint, after all, and is only a little away from level 9 pseudo-saint. It wouldn't be surprising if he had some method to change his own luck in the river of luck. Luo Fan's expression became extremely ugly as he thought of this. He glanced at Kai Buozi, who seemed to have gained some sort of enlightenment in the wormhole and was heading towards the entrance of the next world. He raised his hand and waved. In an instant, the many universes disappeared into the void. Although he could not go back on his word and stop Kai Buozi's test because he had not confirmed the truth yet, this did not mean that he was willing to look at Kai Buozi again. However, this did not mean that he was willing to look at Kai Buozi again. After hiding the many universes, Luo Fan began to carefully sense the point on the river of luck that corresponded to him. He then sensed the point that was extremely far away from him, but through some special method, he was able to exert pressure on the point that corresponded to him. Whether it was the method of Kai Buozi or the situation caused by the natural operation of the river of luck, Luo Fan was definitely not willing to be a supporting character and become a foil for Kai Buozi's opportunity so that Kai Buozi could use his power to obtain benefits. Therefore, obviously, given this mentality, the first thing that Luo Fan had to do was to eliminate the oppression that Kai Buozi's luck had on his luck. He had to let his luck return to its original independent state. Luo Fan wanted to cut off his connection with the river of luck so that he could obtain true freedom and not be controlled by the river of luck. Right now, he couldn't do this because of his ability, but it didn't mean that he had succumbed to the river of luck. Adding the river of luck to himself wasn't something that came from his heart. Clearly, this was the control that the river of luck had over him. Of course, this kind of control was something he abhorred the most. When Luo Fan used all his attention to sense it, this originally huge and incomparably long river of luck began to constantly change. It looked like a long river that flowed like water. Gradually, they turned into small dots. Each of them seemed to be the same little dots that corresponded to Luo Fan and the long river of luck. These little dots, they were tightly packed together. Gathered in one place, it was almost like the legendary atoms formed this long river. In fact, according to the research of scientific and technological civilization, every substance in the world was made up of various atoms through various special combinations. The river water seemed to be continuous without any gaps, but in fact, it was also made up of tiny atoms in the long river of luck. The little dots that corresponded to Luo Fan and the long river of luck were like atoms in the river water. After being densely packed together, they formed the original river water of the long river of luck. Strictly speaking, the dot that corresponded to Luo Fan on the long river of luck was just an ordinary dot in the river water. The reason why Luo Fan could discover his own dot was that he couldn't discover that the other river water of the long river of luck was also made up of these dots. The reason was extremely simple. It was like a black dot on a piece of white paper that was extremely obvious. Because this dot was closely related to him, he was able to find it among the endless small dots. Most people would notice the existence of a black dot on a piece of white paper at a glance, not because the black dot was huge, but because the black dot was different from the others. In other words, it was easy to understand. If one didn't view a piece of white paper as a whole, but as a combination of countless parts of the same size as the black dot, the piece of white paper would become countless dots. Among them, one would be a black dot, while the rest would be white dots. This situation was very similar to the situation in the Long River of Luck, so that's how it is. I should have thought of it. Luo Fan sighed. The Long River of Luck filled the demon realm and the entire earth. It even filled the entire chaotic state. Such a massive river of luck was actually formed from these tiny specks that were like specks of dust, so it was obvious how many specks there were in it. Furthermore, every single one of these dots represented someone's luck. It was easy to imagine how many living beings were behind all of these dots. After figuring this out, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel shocked. Previously, when he sensed that he was still under the control of the Long River of Luck, he instinctively wanted to break free from it. However, he didn't think about how vast and terrifying the Long River of Luck was. Now that he was truly comprehending the Long River of Luck, he finally realized how terrifying the reality behind the Long River of Luck was. Can I really break free from such a vast Long River of Luck? Luo Fan couldn't help but wonder. An inexplicable bitter smile gradually appeared on his face. However, his Tao heart was extremely firm in the end, and it was perfect and flawless. Thus, he quickly recovered from his shock. No matter how vast and unbelievable the Long River of Luck was, he had to break free from the shackles of the Long River of Luck if he wanted to obtain true eternity and true freedom. He had to sever the connection between himself and the Long River of Luck. After making up his mind, Luo Fan continued to sense the Long River of Luck. As his senses went deeper, he gradually discovered many things that he didn't know before. The dot that he corresponded to in the Long River of Luck existed in the entire Long River of Luck. The endless dots were all closely connected. Around the point that he was pointing at, there were countless points that were tightly binding that point. That point was also restraining every other point, and the other points were also restraining each other. Just like that, the restraints continuously overlapped and repeated, making it difficult for the countless specks to move freely. They were all affected by the countless specks in the surroundings at all times, flowing along with the flow of the Luck River at all times, unable to act on their own. He couldn't break free this. This was the truth of the Long River of Luck. This was the fundamental reason why Luo Fan couldn't break free from the influence of the Long River of Luck. Just the points that Luo Fan could sense at this time, which were closely related to his corresponding point, had already been calculated in the trillions of trillions behind the Long River of Luck that Luo Fan couldn't sense. Moreover, there were countless deeper layers of forces acting on that dot. This was calculated. There were countless trillions of dots in this area that he could sense that were connected to the dot that he corresponded to. This kind of interaction was almost beyond the limits of what numbers could describe. To break free from the Long River of Luck, it was equivalent to completely cutting off the influence that was beyond the limits of what numbers could describe. One could only imagine the difficulty of this task. It should be known that, even on the same planet, it was almost impossible to completely cut off the relationship between two people. No matter how you tried to avoid it, no matter how hard you tried to cut off contact with someone, or how hard you tried to avoid contact with that person, you could always be contacted by that person through the circulation of a few friends. This was even the case for a single person on a single planet. To cut off contact with countless people in countless worlds was obviously countless times more difficult than cutting off contact with a single person. As his understanding of the Long River of Luck deepened, Luo Fan understood how big of a project he had to do in the future. However, even so, he wasn't discouraged. Although the difficulty was greater than he had imagined, he had already mentally prepared himself for any difficulty. After carefully sensing for a while, Luo Fan threw other problems to the back of his mind, and began to carefully sense the connection between his dot and the dot that Kai Fu corresponded to. This time, he sensed the long river of luck to get rid of the suppression formed by Kai Fu's luck on his own luck. As for sensing other things, that was a matter for the future. If he wasted time sensing those things now, he obviously couldn't distinguish the priority. When Luo Fan completely focused his senses on these two dots, the two dots became bigger and bigger in his senses. At first, it was just like a speck of dust, but after a while it became the size of a fist, and after a while it became the size of a basketball. Then it became the size of a mountain, then a planet, and then a star. Finally, when Luo Fan pushed his senses to the limit and magnified those two dots to the limit of what he could do, the two small dots had each become a vast and boundless world. An illusory speck that was like a speck of dust in the long river of Luck Dao had become a vast and boundless world with infinite space and time. Compared to the so-called world in a grain of sand and a Bodhi in a leaf, it was countless times greater. World. These two worlds were reflected in Luo Fan's eyes at the same time, and there was a faint smile on his face. The changes in front of him were beyond his expectations. Although he had thought that these dots might change after being magnified to the limit, he only thought that they might be a human figure. For example, the dot corresponding to him would be his body, his image, and the dot corresponding to Kai Fuzi would be Kai Fuzi's body, Kai Fuzi's image, that's all. Unexpectedly, what was happening in front of him was even more mysterious and incredible than he had imagined. These two worlds were more vast and boundless than any world that Luo Fan knew. Each space was hundreds of millions of light-years wide, and the existence of all kinds of similar creatures in each world was also endless. It felt like it was even beyond the limits of what could be described with numbers. Half of the creatures in the world that Luo Fan corresponded to were always in that world, playing the role of various identities to survive in that world. They were fighting and scheming against each other in that world, while the other half were like diligent worker bees, constantly entering and exiting that world through some extremely strange methods, going to the countless other worlds around it. They would either bring some things to those worlds, or obtain some strange things from those worlds and bring them back to his world. That was the case in his world. However, the world that Kai Fu corresponded to was not the same. In the world that Kai Fu corresponded to, all the creatures were constantly entering and exiting that world. The entire world was like a transit station, or a warehouse. There was no creature residing there at all. All the creatures were constantly moving the things in that world out of that world, and then moving back some strange things from other worlds. Looking at the difference between the two worlds, Luo Fan instantly understood. The reason why his world was so different from the world that Kai Fu corresponded to was because. The fundamental reason. It was because he had already cut off a small part of the connection between himself and the long river of luck through the use of the law of cause and effect. Before he cut off that small part of the connection, the world that he corresponded to was definitely the same as the world that Kai Fu corresponded to. It was definitely the same as Kai Fuzi's world. It also treated the world it corresponded to as a transit station, and there were no living beings living in that world. And if he could really cut off the connection between himself and the long river of luck in the future, then the world that he corresponded to would change again. All the creatures would no longer leave the world that he corresponded to, and instead, they would all settle down and live in his world. However, what was the meaning of this? Luo Fan was still confused at this time. He had just seen these little dots and worlds, and had no idea about the nature of those creatures at all. How could he really know the meaning of those creatures staying in that world? With a thought, Luo Fan slightly shifted his gaze, and also included the hundreds of thousands of little dots in the surroundings into his own magnified senses. Although there were hundreds of thousands of little dots, from a macroscopic perspective, or perhaps from an ordinary person's point of view, this area was not even a millimeter in diameter. In an instant, hundreds of thousands of worlds were seen by Luo Fan. These hundreds of thousands of worlds, each of them corresponded to the world that Luo Fan and Kai Fu corresponded to. These worlds were also the worlds that had the closest connection with the world that Luo Fan corresponded to. Many of the creatures that left Luo Fan's world had entered these worlds to exchange materials with them. The materials that were brought back from those worlds to Luo Fan's world still had a strange interaction with their original world, which made Luo Fan's world unable to break free, move freely, and leave freely. Obviously, the connection between those materials and the original world was the source of the close connection between the point that Luo Fan corresponded to his own world and other points in the long river of luck that he had sensed from a macroscopic perspective. After discovering this, Luo Fan suddenly understood part of the meaning of leaving those creatures in his own world. If those creatures stayed in the world and did not bring materials to other worlds to exchange for materials, this world would no longer obtain materials from other worlds, and the interaction force that this world received from other worlds would constantly decrease. This was a way to sever the connection, of course. This was only what Luo Fan had guessed based on his current understanding. As his understanding of that world deepened, he would definitely be able to obtain more and more information, and would definitely be able to guess more and more mysteries. With a thought, Luo Fan's perception once again focused on the world that corresponded to him and the world that corresponded to Kai Fu. In an instant, the existences of the two worlds were reflected in his eyes again. To Luo Fan, the world that corresponded to Kai Fu should have been as ordinary as the other worlds around him. However, at this moment there was a strange connection between these two worlds, so the world that corresponded to Kai Fu became extremely conspicuous in Luo Fan's eyes. This allowed him to directly find that world among the endless world. As Luo Fan observed, he discovered that the number and frequency of creatures coming and going between these two worlds was unimaginably fast. It could be said that it was almost every moment. There were billions of creatures leaving from Luo Fan's world with materials, then entering Kai Fu's world, then bringing materials from Kai Fu's world, returning to Luo Fan's world. Similarly, in the corresponding world of the float, there were also hundreds of millions of creatures carrying materials into Luo Fan's world, and then bringing materials back from Luo Fan's world. Compared to the countless living beings that constantly entered and exited the two worlds, the number of living beings that numbered in the hundreds of millions was extremely insignificant. It was almost as small as a grain of sand in the normal universe, but it was still an extremely huge number in itself. Compared to Luo Fan's world and other ordinary worlds, there were only 3 to 5 creatures occasionally. 7 to 8 creatures entering and exiting. The difference was obvious at a glance. Luo Fan looked at this change and instantly thought to himself, I see. It seems that as long as I cut off this connection, I can completely eliminate the suppression of luck. Eliminating the parts that didn't conform to normal. Naturally, it could make the results that didn't conform to normal disappear. This was just a simple logical deduction, and even an ordinary person could do it. For an existence like Luo Fan, it was naturally no problem at all. However, such an action could only treat the symptoms and not the root cause. If he couldn't find the root cause of this anomaly, how could he guarantee that it wouldn't happen again in the future? How could he guarantee that this connection wouldn't be re-established in the future? Sensing such a change, Luo Fan had an idea. He separated a bit of his consciousness to enter his corresponding world to take a look at the situation in that world. He even wanted to use the connection between the worlds to go to Kai Fu's corresponding world. To an existence like Luo Fan, separating his consciousness to enter a certain world was like blinking an ordinary person. It was an almost instinctive action. Normally, as long as he could sense a world, he could easily do this. However, it was clear that the current situation was not an ordinary one. The world in front of him wasn't any of the worlds that Luo Fan had sensed before, but a world in the long river of luck. It was a world that was connected to him in an extremely mysterious and unbelievable way. The originally smooth process couldn't be carried out at this moment. When Luo Fan's consciousness rushed towards that world seemed to be an illusion that didn't exist at all. No matter how his consciousness condensed, collided, or drilled, he could only pass through it. He couldn't even touch that world, let alone enter it. After using thousands of methods and trying tens of thousands of times, Luo Fan finally understood that that world wasn't something that he could come into contact with now. He couldn't help but sigh. Things really aren't that simple. When he saw the root of the connection between these worlds and other worlds, he had vaguely thought of a way to resolve the involuntary connection between his corresponding world and other worlds. Enter that world, seal all living beings, and make them lose the ability to leave that world, thus cutting off this channel of communication with other worlds. Then, he would make his world truly independent so that his luck would no longer be shackled and affected by the long river of luck. Although he didn't have much hope for this method and knew that things wouldn't be so simple, it was a train of thought after all. After all, there was a chance that it could solve the problem, so it was naturally impossible not to give it a try. Unfortunately, the long river of luck wasn't even willing to leave this last method for Luo Fan. If he couldn't even really come into contact with the worlds in the long river of luck, and couldn't even enter that world, how could he talk about sealing that world and making the living beings in that world lose the ability to leave that world and communicate with other worlds? With a sigh, Luo Fan slowly retracted that bit of will of his. Since this method couldn't succeed, he could only think of other ways. After failing once, Luo Fan focused even more on sensing the two worlds, observing the hundreds of millions of creatures that were exchanging matter between the two worlds. Chapter 1401. Luo Fan could not directly invade the world with his consciousness and sense everything as if he was in the world himself, so he could only use indirect methods to do this. His mind was extremely calm. All of his senses and attention were focused on the two worlds. He tried his best to sense the inside of the two worlds and communicate with each other about the changes that happened to the substances after they entered the two worlds. It was a boundless world, and there were billions of living beings that brought all sorts of substances in and out of the two worlds at all times. It was obviously extremely difficult to find the changes that happened to all the things that were exchanged, and to discover the final results of those changes. It was the same for Luo Fan. Luo Fan quietly floated in the cave abode. The two worlds reflected in his eyes slowly rotated. Countless living beings entered and left the two worlds, and the process of circulation became extremely huge, clear, detailed. The substances that each living being brought out of a world could be real substances, or they could be illusory and invisible substances. These substances had different properties, and because they were messy, it was difficult to completely separate the substances that were circulating normally from the substances that caused his luck to be suppressed. This made it impossible for Luo Fan to find the results he wanted through this kind of sensing at all. Luo Fan carefully sensed for close to a year. During this year, he memorized the countless substances, and even used his outstanding intelligence to combine the countless possible combinations. However, in the end, he discovered that this method could not succeed at all. He couldn't succeed at all. It was impossible for him to find the source of the luck Dao suppression through this method. This method doesn't work at all. As Luo Fan thought this, he frowned deeply. At this moment, he stopped sensing the many living beings that were communicating between the two worlds. The two worlds reflected in his eyes were still rotating in his eyes, but the originally extremely clear living beings that kept entering and leaving the worlds gradually became blurry. Since he couldn't do it from the living beings, he could only do it from the two worlds themselves. Because he couldn't find any way to find what he was looking for, Luo Fan didn't say that he was discouraged. But after all, he would not be in a good mood. In this unpleasant mood, He looked at the two worlds again and suddenly felt reluctant to move. He floated in the cave abode, and his eyes gradually became empty. His attention was locked onto the two worlds, quietly watching the two worlds evolve. Looking at the various incredible natural and civilized landscapes in the two worlds, Lin Fan was stunned. He didn't try to probe or deduce. He just quietly felt the inexplicable emotions brought to him by the various sceneries. During this process, time gradually passed. In the blink of an eye, another 10 years had passed. Suddenly, at a certain moment, Luo Fan suddenly had an incomparably strange feeling. This feeling came from the world that corresponded to him. In that world, he could faintly sense that countless living beings' wills were undergoing an inexplicable change. It was as if they were working together to summon him and chant him. This feeling made Luo Fan's eyes brighten. No matter what he discovered, as long as there was a new discovery, it would be a good thing for him. He carefully savored this strange feeling. His mind gradually merged with this feeling. Then, following this feeling, he slowly sent his will towards the place where the living beings were chanting and summoning. Although he also used his will to enter that world, the situation this time was completely different from the last time. The last time, Luo Fan took the initiative to invade, but this time, the living beings in that world took the initiative to summon him. This change between being active and being passive resulted in two completely different results. Last time, his will couldn't even come into contact with that world. He didn't even have the qualifications to be obstructed by that world. However, this time, he easily threw his will into the world that corresponded to him. He threw his will into the boundless land, into a statue that stood in the center of this world, almost as if it could support the heavens and the earth. This statue was extremely huge and mysterious. As soon as his will entered it, the statue instantly came to life. The body that was originally constructed from all sorts of special materials turned into a body of flesh and blood in the blink of an eye, making him feel like he had gained another body. Sensing this change, Luo Fan, who was in the cave abode, slowly closed his eyes. His attention was completely focused on the will that had entered the corresponding world. Following this change, Luo Fan felt that he had truly stepped into this world. As he looked around, a boundless world appeared before his eyes. It gave him an indescribably mysterious feeling. It was as if he had already entered his own body. Just as Luo Fan was sizing up this world, a voice that was the combination of countless voices came from all directions. "Welcome, Divine Master." Luo Fan lowered his head to look at his feet. He saw that, starting from his feet, there were living beings that looked as tiny as a speck of dust continuously spreading out until they reached beyond his line of sight. Just now, the extremely loud and shocking sound was emitted by these tiny creatures that were as tiny as dust particles. The combined voice of such tiny living beings produced such a shocking effect. Even Luo Fan was shocked. One could imagine how many living beings there were. So, in their eyes, I'm the Divine Master. Luo Fan thought to himself. With a thought, his indomitable body quickly shrunk. In the blink of an eye, he shrunk from his original appearance of stepping on the ground and above his head to the size of a speck of dust, the same size as those living beings. When he shrunk to this extent, the world in his eyes changed once again. The seemingly boundless specks of dust had turned into endless human figures at this moment. They were densely piled up in one place, stretching out in all directions. It had reached a frightening level. Looking into the distance, all he could see were human heads. Apart from the human heads, there was no other terrain. What distant mountains, everything, all disappeared. This number had almost reached the number of grains of sand in the Ganges River. Go 10, 100,000, 10,000, 100,000,000, Zhao Jing, Gai Li Reng, Go Jian, Zheng, Zai Ji Ganges, Asang Si, inconceivable, immeasurable. The number of grains of sand in the Ganges River was a number that was 10 orders of magnitude greater than Zhao. The numerous living beings were obviously very tightly organized. At this moment, there were 36 old men standing in front of Luo Fan. These 36 old men, like the countless other living beings, were also looking at Luo Fan with an incomparably fanatical gaze. That gaze, that expression, if they were to be classified by believers, they would definitely be above the level of fanatics, and might even be existences at the level of Holy Spirit. When all of them saw Luo Fan suddenly shrink from his boundlessly tall appearance to his current appearance of the same size as them, they could not maintain their calm at all. Everyone knelt at the same time. They prostrated on the ground and kowtowed to Luo Fan again. "Welcome, Lord God." If Luo Fan wanted to enjoy the feeling of being worshipped by others, he could enjoy it almost every moment. As long as he moved casually, he could naturally create countless worlds and countless living beings to worship him. Therefore, facing this unknown number of living beings worshipping him at this moment, he appeared extremely calm. He said indifferently, "Dispense with the formalities. All of you, stand up and speak. I have something to ask all of you." As soon as his voice left his mouth, the entire world began to undergo a miraculous change. All the living beings heard his voice in an instant. Moreover, in the sky above, the originally normal sky was suddenly filled with endless rays of light. These lights were of various colors, and they combined to form an incomparably beautiful, majestic, and holy appearance that shook the entire world. It caused all the living beings in this world to naturally feel an indescribable sense of reverence, and an indescribable joy. This phenomenon disappeared extremely slowly. It was not like other phenomena, which disappeared in an instant. Instead, it existed for a long time. It was as if it was about to turn into the normal scenery of this world. Yes. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the countless living beings in the surroundings no longer had any doubts about Luo Fan's Lord God nature. They shouted in unison and stood up in a fanatical manner. As soon as all of them responded, Luo Fan vaguely received endless information. This information included information about the structure of this world's civilization, why countless people regarded him as a Lord God, and why they had summoned him to descend, and so on and so forth. Almost all the information he wanted to know. The source of this information was completely random. It was as if it had existed in his heart for a long time, but he had not revealed it in the past. He did not know why it was suddenly revealed this time. However, Luo Fan did not pay too much attention to such an obviously inconceivable fact. At this moment, he was fully immersed in the information. So that's how it is. Although this world was a world with a round sky and a square earth, its surface area was boundless. However, its surface area was boundlessly vast. It was unknown how many billions of light-years it covered. In such a world, the differences in topography were extremely strange. The main body of this world was land. Although there was also an ocean, it was not like other worlds where the ocean enveloped the land. Instead, it was the other way around. The land enveloped the ocean. The entire world had countless boundless oceans. The area of the oceans might even occupy 1/3 of the entire world's area. There were all sorts of strange terrains on the land, and the living beings that were born from it were endless. No matter how powerful or intelligent the people in this world were, they would not be able to distinguish them. They would not even know the number of living beings that were born in this world at any given moment. The living beings that were born in this vast world were different from other worlds, which were usually divided into many countries. In fact, there were no countries in this world at all. The living beings that were born in this world knew this as soon as they were born. They were born because of the legendary Lord God. They also knew that this world also existed because of the Lord God. Because they knew this information, the living beings in this world could not be separated from each other no matter how far apart they were. Their hearts were also closely connected. Therefore, even though the living beings in this world had countless battles and grudges, they did not have the thought of living independently from other living beings. In their hearts they knew this very clearly. From a certain point of view, they and others, even if they were their enemies, even if they were existences that they wanted to scheme against until they died, were all companions. This situation had existed for an unknown period of time. It had always existed. For an unknown number of billions of years, all the living beings in this world had been following their instincts to enter and exit this world. They brought all kinds of materials that belonged to this world to other worlds and interacted with the living beings in other worlds. They would trade with them and bring more materials to strengthen this world so that their homeland would continue to grow and improve. However, this situation changed several hundred years ago. On a certain day several hundred years ago, all of a sudden, half of the living beings in this world discovered that they had lost the ability to enter and exit this world. Their instincts. However, they told them that this was a good thing. This caused the living beings who had lost the ability to enter and exit this world to feel somewhat at a loss. Because of this change, although there were all kinds of grudges and schemes between the living beings in this world, for the first time, the countless living beings who fought against each other split up. Those living beings who had not experienced this change regarded themselves as the orthodox of this world and began to look down on the living beings who had lost the ability to enter and exit this world. As for those living beings who had lost their ability, they instinctively felt that the living beings who entered and exited this world and traded with other worlds were the ones who had betrayed this world and were the ones who were destroying the foundation of this world. This situation became more and more intense as time passed. In the beginning, it was just that they could not stand the sight of each other and had less and less contact with each other. However, as time passed, the dislike between the two sides gradually turned into resentment and hatred. Some conflicts between the two sides that were originally impossible to appear gradually began to appear. Because the time of the split was not long enough, these conflicts were still within a controllable range and had not really developed to the point of a real large-scale war. However, based on the current trend, the final large-scale war was almost inevitable. There were so many living beings in this world. Even if there was only one in a billion who was slightly smarter than the others, there were still countless smart people. Among these smart people, there was only one in a billion who was slightly smarter than the others, and there were still countless people who were smarter than the others. Given the number of living beings in this world, this cycle could almost be repeated countless times. Therefore, there were definitely extremely intelligent living beings in this world who could see through the dangers and think of solutions. The 36 old men in front of Luo Fan were such living beings. They belonged to two camps. Among them, 18 belonged to the living beings who were still constantly entering and exiting this world and trading with other worlds. The remaining 18 belonged to the camp of living beings who had suddenly changed hundreds of years ago and lost this ability to enter and exit this world. As extremely intelligent beings who could see the dangers and think of solutions, the 36 old men naturally had enough rationality to control their emotions. Therefore, they abandoned the enmity between the two factions and discussed a mutually acceptable solution to the crisis that the world was facing. The solution was very simple. It was to gather the thoughts of most living beings in this world and summon the Master God who allowed this world to exist and give birth to all living beings. The Master God would use his supreme ability to resolve the crisis that this world was facing at this moment. As for the method to summon the Master God, it was needless to say. How could an endless number of living beings not be able to create such an exquisite method to achieve this? After understanding the reason why he came to this world, Luo Fan sighed. Back then, I actually severed a portion of the karma in my luck path, but it actually resulted in this outcome. The saying that the world is unpredictable is not a lie. Back then, he simply wanted to sever the connection between himself and the river of luck path because he really could not sever it completely. He could only do his best to sever as much of his luck path as possible, which resulted in a portion of his luck path being severed. This also resulted in the countless living beings in this world that corresponded to the River of Luck path at this moment. There was no doubt about this. Through the information that he suddenly received, Luo Fan clearly remembered it. The time when those living beings changed was the instant when he used the second level of the law of karma to sever his luck path. Not only did the timing match, but the logic behind it also matched. After he used the second level of the law of karma to sever his luck path, he discovered that the corresponding point in the River of Luck path had become much dimmer than before. At first, he only thought that it was an inevitable change, but after discovering that the small point was actually an extremely complete world, he understood. How was it an inevitable change? It was clearly because he severed the karma connection, causing almost half of the living beings to change and no longer enter and exit this world, causing the material exchange between this world and other worlds to weaken by almost half. The corresponding point in the River of Luck path for living beings was a world. The reason why the world would emit light was naturally because the world's power leaked out, making it seem like it was glowing in the outside world. If the material exchange with the outside world decreased, the frequency of living beings entering and exiting would decrease. The leakage of power would naturally decrease, and it was only natural that the light would dim. After thinking about all of this, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little scared. Fortunately, these living beings had thought of summoning him. Otherwise, when the conflict between the two factions in this world accumulated to the limit in the future, it would start an endless war and all the living beings would be wiped out. To him, that would be a disaster with an unpredictable outcome for this world. Luo Fan could only sense things that had happened in the past few years. It could be said that he was extremely unfamiliar with this world. He did not know what would happen if all the living beings in this world completely disappeared. However, he instinctively knew that it would definitely be a disaster that could not be dealt with, and could even affect his life. "You did well to know to summon me," Luo Fan said calmly. As he said that, the phenomenon that had already weakened in this world surged again, making the entire world even more sacred, more majestic, more wonderful. Moreover, because of what he said, all the living beings in this world were naturally filled with indescribable joy. In fact, some living beings could not handle this surprise. They directly fainted on the ground, their faces full of blissful smiles, and they lost all perception of the outside world. To be able to serve the Lord God is our lifelong pursuit. The 36 old men who were closest to Luo Fan said enthusiastically at this moment. Luo Fan smiled slightly. This smile made the colors of the entire world become more vivid. At this moment, Luo Fan also realized that all of his actions could cause so many incredible phenomena in this world was not because he was the creator of this world, nor was it because he could control the entire world and change it according to his will. It was because this was the will of all living beings. The number of living beings in this world had even exceeded the limit of what could be described with numbers. And all of these living beings thought that Luo Fan was the creator of this world, and they all thought that Luo Fan was the supreme ruler of this world. The will of one person did not have too much power, and it could not even affect reality. However, the will of thousands of people was already powerful enough to push an ordinary living being to the point of achieving immortality. Chapter 1402. Countless living beings felt that Luo Fan was the supreme and omnipotent supreme god. Then, Luo Fan in this world naturally had all the powers that a supreme god should have. Thus, in this world, he naturally had all the powers that a supreme god should have. This kind of power that could change the world with his words, and change his thoughts, and change the world was naturally almost an ability that he had instinctively. Luo Fan also had a headache regarding the crisis that the world was facing. In this world, he had absolute prestige. It was not difficult for him to unify the opinions of all living beings, or even to make all living beings lose the ability to travel to other worlds and communicate with other worlds. However, this method was only treating the symptoms and not the root cause. Now that the opinions of these living beings were unified, this world was still giving birth to living beings every moment. These newly born living beings would not be completely unified by Luo Fan like the current living beings. They would still follow their instinctive inclinations. This way, it was fine if there were only a few of them. Because they were weak, they would naturally pretend to have the same opinion as the existing living beings. However, as time continued to pass, when the number of existing living beings gradually decreased, and the number of newly born living beings increased, the power balance between the two parties was finally balanced again. At that time, the crisis that the world was facing at this moment would definitely appear again. Moreover, because they had been suppressed for too long, it might cause conflicts to deepen, and an even more shocking and terrifying war would occur, causing more losses to the living beings in this world. This would cause more damage to the world. Therefore, it was impossible to directly use the infinite power that he possessed to unify the opinions of all living beings. After figuring out the pros and cons, Luo Fan also knew how to cure these different opinions. That was to directly change the nature of this world, so that the living beings born in this world would no longer have the ability to leave this world. They could only survive in this world, cultivate in this world, and grow in this world. This was the only way. This was the only way to avoid the crisis that this world was facing at this moment forever. This was the only way to prevent all living beings in this world from having a chance to cause a war that involved all living beings in this world. However, it was a pity that if Luo Fan could achieve that, it would practically be equivalent to severing the connection between his luck and the River of Luck. It would be equivalent to breaking free from the control of the River of Luck. He had obtained the true freedom that he now knew. Obviously, with Luo Fan's current ability, with his current cultivation base and his current understanding of the River of Luck Tao, how could he do this? Although the will of all living beings gathered together was unbelievably powerful. But to push Luo Fan's power to a level that was comparable to that of a saint, that was obviously impossible. We need to establish an orderly fighting mechanism so that the conflict between the two factions can be continuously whittled away under such a fighting mechanism, and finally be maintained within an acceptable range. Luo Fan wasn't an ordinary person, so he quickly thought of a solution. Fighting was absolutely unavoidable in this world. To limit the scale of the fighting to a certain aspect, to a certain level, that was the true wisdom. This thought flashed through his mind, and based on this idea, countless specific plans and ideas began to emerge in his mind. Soon, Luo Fan chose the one that seemed to be the most feasible and had the least loss. This world was so vast and there were so many living beings in it. This method must be extremely adaptable. It must be able to solve all the fighting, be acceptable to everyone, and be able to minimize the loss. It was imaginable how difficult it was. Luo Fan had traveled to an unknown number of trillions of worlds, and the civilizations he had seen were even more numerous. Among those endless civilizations, he could almost find a corresponding world that could implement his ideas if he had any ideas. Therefore, to find a solution to this kind of conflict, it was not just an idea. It was also a method that could be implemented in a certain world. To solve this problem, it could be said to be difficult, but it could also be said to be simple. That was sports. Of course, this kind of sports could not be ordinary sports like basketball or football. It needed to be more exciting and difficult. In Luo Fan's memory, there was such a sports activity. It was a fighting game. The rules of this kind of fighting game were extremely strict. The punishment for losing was the direct deprivation of one's memories and strength. If this kind of game was in an ordinary civilization, it would definitely be a horrifying game that was enough to make everyone afraid. However, in this world where a super large-scale war was about to break out, using this kind of game to replace the upcoming war was obviously many times better. After choosing the project, The next thing to do was naturally to make all living beings in this world that existed now and would be born in the future unable to go beyond the limits of this game. This was almost impossible for ordinary people. Even for ordinary cultivators, it was an incredible miracle. However, for Luo Fan, who now had almost omnipotent power in this world, this was an extremely easy thing to do. With a thought, the rules and regulations of this entire world would naturally change. A layer of virtual network was naturally born from this layer of rules and regulations. It began to make the situation of this entire world undergo some extremely subtle changes. This network of nothingness was none other than the battle network. A virtual network that did not rely on any physical objects, but only relied on this world and the rules and regulations of this world. This was the greatest function of the network itself. It was to connect the consciousness of all living beings in this world, regardless of whether they existed now or were about to be born in the future. As a result, all living beings were equivalent to a terminal in this combat network, causing the consciousness of all living beings to appear to be connected at an even higher level. The moment this vast and boundless combat network appeared, all living beings that existed in this world that almost surpassed the limits of what could be described by numbers instantly felt its existence. In a trance, all of them had entered a strange, independent space. This was a space in its most primitive state. It was a grayish haze. A large egg that could only contain their existence. The existence of this large egg caused every living being that entered this combat network to feel incomparably sullen, incomparably vexed. Almost instinctively, they wanted to break the limits of this egg. Instinctively, they wanted to break this egg. And after this egg was broken, it formed a space, one that was based on the spiritual characteristics of every living being. Physical characteristics, personality, and many other factors that formed a space. This way, the space formed by every living being. It was completely different from any other living being's space. Every living being's space had their own unique characteristics, those densely packed infinite spaces that surpassed the limits of what could be described by numbers were piled together. This caused this combat network to form a vast world that was millions and millions of times larger than this real world. A boundless and vast world formed by countless tiny spaces. The moment their respective spaces were born, all living beings that entered the combat network with their consciousness instantly received the information that Luo Fan had left in this combat network. Everyone instantly knew the use of this combat network. The consciousness of every living being was tightly connected to this combat network. This combat network was incomparably mysterious. As long as any two living beings wanted to fight, the combat network would naturally connect their spaces together. All of their consciousnesses would be completely pulled into that space, and they would begin to fight on a fair field. If the battle was won, not only would that space devour 90% of the loser's space, but it could also erase a certain period of the loser's memories at will according to the advantage of victory. The greater the advantage, the greater the amount of memories that could be erased, and the extent to which an individual's space could grow also had an extremely large limit. After growing to 10 million times the size of their normal space, it could no longer continue to grow and be permanently fixed. At that time, if they fought with other living beings and won, they could only erase their opponent's memories. As for the opponent's space, they would no longer be able to devour it. If they forcefully tried to devour it, it might even cause a backlash, and cause their own space to collapse instead. After understanding the changes of this combat network, all the living beings in this world instantly understood the meaning of this combat network's existence. In an instant, the 36 old men closest to Luo Fan understood the benefits of this change. In an instant, their respect for Luo Fan increased, and they became even more fanatical. Almost in the instant that they came back to their senses, they knelt on the ground at the first instant. Endless words of praise swarmed towards Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan did not pay much attention to them at this moment. His eyes pierced through the void, directly looking at the endless space that existed within the combat network. And with his own thoughts, he slightly adjusted the combat network, making the connection between the combat network and the rules and laws even tighter, making its relationship with this world even more difficult to separate and isolate. As something that had just been born, it was obviously impossible for it to become incomparably perfect in an instant. Without enough adjustments, without spending enough energy to improve it, there would definitely be many oversights. It was the same for this combat network. Even if it was created by Luo Fan, even if it was one with this entire world and could not be separated, it was still impossible to change this fundamental law. This combat network also had many oversights that he could not have imagined before it was created. Some of these oversights might not be important, and would not have much impact on the existence of the entire combat network. However, there were also some extremely huge oversights that could even affect the existence of the entire combat network, enough to destroy the entire combat network in a single day. Just like at this very moment, this combat network had only existed for a few dozen breaths of time, and Luo Fan had already adjusted who knew how many millions of oversights, or perhaps the legendary bugs. Instead, it caused the perfection of the entire battle net to rise by several notches. As the Supreme Divine Master, Luo Fan naturally did not need to explain anything to these living beings. He did not want to speak. With a thought, his figure naturally disappeared before everyone's eyes. Although he was still standing where he was, there was no longer any living being that could see his existence. As an omnipotent, supreme existence, especially this kind of omnipotence, this kind of supreme power was something that came from the will of all living beings. It was something that needed to be maintained the most. It was not something else. It was the sense of mystery. Only by maintaining a sufficient sense of mystery could it make those living beings continue to think that he was omnipotent, that he was supreme. And only by doing so could it make his omnipotent, supreme concept even more deeply engraved in the hearts of all living beings. As for the current Luo Fan, he would do his best to reduce his contact with those living beings. This was his method of maintaining his sense of mystery. As expected, after Luo Fan disappeared before everyone's eyes, the living beings in this world did not feel that anything was wrong. Not a single one of them thought that Luo Fan needed to say anything to them before he could leave. On the contrary. Instead, everyone was even more certain that Luo Fan was the Supreme Divine Master. They all left the battle network and kowtowed to the position where Luo Fan was at the center. They repeatedly said, "Farewell, Divine Master." Luo Fan naturally didn't care about them. Feeling his increasingly powerful might in this world, he just smiled and began to carefully observe the battle network. Bit by bit, he adjusted the various aspects of the battle network and eliminated some of the bugs that were discovered one after another. After all, the number of living beings that came to welcome the arrival of Luo Fan was innumerable, and they even belonged to two camps. After discovering that Luo Fan had really left, the originally harmonious scene instantly changed, and in the blink of an eye, it became extremely tense. Even the 36 old men who were the closest to Luo Fan previously also became tense at this moment. They observed each other and were on guard against each other. It was as if they were picking their own opponents, but at the same time, they were guarding against being regarded as opponents by others. Even they, who were wise and farsighted, were like this. It was easy to imagine what the other living beings who were far inferior to them were like. In the blink of an eye, the endless space of the battle network was connected to each other by an unknown number of trillions, forming an unknown number of trillions of battlefields. Such a huge number of battles occurred at the same time. If it was any other network, even if it was a virtual network with a planet as the core, or even a galaxy as the carrier, it would definitely be unable to withstand such a huge number of calculations and completely collapse in an instant. But here, in this vast world whose surface area was measured in trillions of light years, there were many things that were different. Such a large number of calculations did not put any pressure on the battle network at all. Not to mention collapsing, it couldn't even cause more bugs to appear in the BattleNet. The first wave of battles on the battle network quickly ended. In the instant it ended, it was unknown how many living beings in this world suddenly fell to the ground and fell unconscious. This was the appearance of 90% of the space being devoured and a portion of their memories being erased. At the same time, in the battle network, the trillions of spaces that were connected to each other began to separate at this moment. However, when they were connected before, the size of the spaces were about the same. Now that they were separated again, the difference between the two realms had become nearly 20 times greater. Those living beings who had obtained victory left the battle network. For a moment, they saw their previous opponents lying on the ground around them. The previous battles were incomparably intense. Naturally, there were people who held grudges against their opponents even though they had won. When they saw their opponents lying in front of them without any ability to resist, evil thoughts rose in their hearts. Countless victorious living beings gathered their strength and pounced towards their opponents, who had fainted on the ground. They wanted to take advantage of the fact that their opponents could not resist to get close to them and erase them. Luo Fan was naturally shocked by such a situation that could be easily deduced. He was already prepared for it. After those living beings whose memories had been erased fainted, they were all under the protection of the battle network and all the living beings who were connected to it. Under such circumstances, it would be fine if those living beings did not pounce forward. The moment they did, they would suffer the backlash of the battle network and the countless living beings. All of their powers were of the same magnitude. They would retaliate in the same way. In an instant, those who did not attack harshly were naturally fine. At most, they were only injured. However, those who wanted to kill their opponents with the first move were in trouble. In the blink of an eye, countless beings were killed by the rebound force because of this action. The number of living beings in this world had almost surpassed the limit of numbers. Even if only a small portion of them had evil thoughts when they saw their opponents unconscious on the ground, the absolute number added up was already a shocking and terrifying number. Even among the living beings with evil intentions, there was no one who could resist them. Only a very small portion of them wanted to kill their opponents with one move, but were completely erased by the backlash. The absolute number added up to tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of living beings. In other words, in that instant of change just now, at least tens of billions of living beings in this world had died. Although this casualty rate was not comparable to a large-scale war between all the living beings in this world, however, it was definitely not considered small. At the moment when all the living beings died, Luo Fan felt the luck Dao in his body tremble slightly. An indescribable feeling of awkwardness was transmitted from the luck Dao to his heart, making him feel at this instant that his luck Dao had already suffered some kind of damage. At this moment, he felt that his luck Dao had already suffered some kind of damage. So, this is the result of these living beings dying on a large scale. Luo Fan was even more afraid at this moment. What he was afraid of was that, if he had not been summoned into this world back then, wouldn't he have suffered even greater misfortune when a large-scale war broke out in this world in the future, when all the living beings in this world died to the point where none of them were left. However, even though his luck Dao had suffered some damage from the deaths of tens of billions of living beings, Luo Fan still did not regret it at all. Although the number of these living beings was already extremely high. But it was a process that was bound to happen. If he had told the living beings in this world that they could not attack those unconscious living beings, their impression would definitely not be as deep as their personal experience and witnessing this result. If they did not have a deep impression, they would think that they were lucky. In the future, there would be even more living beings who would try this, and when those living beings tried it, it would naturally bring about endless deaths. At that time, it would seem that there were fewer people dying each time, but in the long run, the number of living beings dying would instead be countless times higher than the current number of tens of billions or even hundreds of billions. In comparison, it was clearly better to not say anything now and let those living beings personally experience this result. Even if there were endless living beings in this world, and the number even surpassed the limit that could be described by numbers. But no matter what, tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of living beings were not a small number. Luo Fan believed that any creature would have an incomparably deep impression of this matter after learning about this number. They would remember the rule that the person who had their memories erased and was unconscious on the ground couldn't attack. It was incomparably clear and incomparably deep. Sure enough, at this time, those creatures who had watched helplessly as someone rushed forward to kill the figure that had already failed and could only lie on the ground were directly smashed into pieces. They were killed using the same move and the same amount of strength. In an instant, they were all stunned, and the rules set by Luo Fan were incomparably deeply engraved in their hearts. In fact, they even made up their minds to pass this rule down so that their descendants and their descendants would deeply remember this rule. Of course, at this moment, they did not have the chance to think too much. Those living beings did not exist independently. Each of them had their own family and their own good friend. Those living beings who had lost and fainted naturally had many people who felt injustice for them and wanted to take revenge for them. Therefore, those living beings who had won were very quickly pulled back into the battle network. Their own space was once again connected to the space of others, and a new round of battle began. True battle strength naturally had little to do with the size of the space in the battle network. However, the battle prowess in the combat network was closely related to the size of the space. Although the victors had already fought once, and had yet to completely recover from the previous battle, because they had devoured the space of the losers, their battle prowess had greatly increased, directly counteracting the disadvantage of their bodies not completely recovering. In comparison, the following battles were similarly not unfair, nor was it as one-sided as those who had not participated in the battles imagined.